Richmond Palace, March 1603. The candles had been burning for 3 days. The room smelled of beeswax and something older, something that had no name, but that everyone in that room recognized. Outside, the Thames moved in the dark, the way it always moved, indifferent to what was happening inside the palace walls. London was holding its breath. The city knew. Cities always know before the announcement comes. Inside, the greatest queen England had ever produced was dying, and she would not do it lying down. Elizabeth I had been queen for 45 years. She had outmaneuvered every king in Europe, outlasted every man who tried to control her, and built an image of herself so complete that her own people had stopped thinking of her as a person and started thinking of her as a permanent condition of the world. Like weather, like the river outside, like the crown itself, the Virgin Queen, Gloriana, good Queen Bess. Now she was 69 years old. Her teeth were gone. The famous red hair was a wig. The face that had been painted 1,000 times looked nothing like those paintings anymore. And the women standing around her in that candlelit room were watching her do something that went against every rule she had ever lived by. She was standing in the middle of the floor. She had been standing there for hours. Her attendants begged her to sit, to rest, to let them help her to the bed. She looked through them like they were made of glass. She knew what lying down meant, and she was not ready. No children, no husband, no Tudor heir. 118 years of a dynasty that had fought and schemed and burned and prayed and executed and built, and it was going to end here, in this room, with an old woman standing alone in candlelight. How did it come to this? Cut to a battlefield, August 1485, a muddy field in the middle of England called Bosworth. The smoke has not yet cleared. There are bodies everywhere, and a man nobody expected to win is about to pick up a crown. This is where it begins. Picture the field after the killing stops. Bosworth, the 22nd of August, 1485. Late summer. The ground is soft from recent rain, and the air smells like blood and smoke, and the particular silence that falls when men stop trying to kill each other. Broken lances in the mud, torn banners, horses that will never stand again. Somewhere in that silence, someone finds a crown. The story England would tell for generations went like this. The crown of Richard III fell from his helmet during the battle, rolled through the mud, and came to rest in a hawthorn bush at the edge of the field. A soldier found it. He brought it to a man standing nearby. That man was Henry Tudor, 28 years old, who had just killed the King of England. Someone lifted the crown from the bush and placed it on Henry's head, right there on the battlefield. No cathedral, no holy oil, no ceremony of any kind. Just a muddy field, a dead king, and a Welsh claimant with a crown that still had someone else's blood on it. The people watching him expected triumph. What they saw instead was a man checking to see if anyone was still planning to kill him. That instinct would define the Tudor dynasty from its first breath. Henry Tudor had spent more than half his life in exile. He left England at 14. Smuggled out after his family ended up on the losing side of the Wars of the Roses, those decades of dynastic civil war that turned the English nobility into armed camps. He grew up in Brittany and France, dependent on foreign charity, watching from a distance as England bled itself. His claim to the English throne existed, but it was thin. It came through his mother, Margaret Beaufort, a woman of iron intelligence, and absolute conviction, who never stopped believing her son would be king, even during the years when that belief looked like madness. He won at Bosworth not because he was the strongest claimant or the best soldier. He won because of one man's decision. Thomas Stanley commanded a large force at Bosworth and spent most of the battle watching from a distance without committing to either side. Richard III had Stanley's son as a hostage. Stanley had every reason to wait. When Richard saw Henry riding across the field with a small escort and charged directly at him with his household cavalry, it was the kind of bold move that ends battles in minutes when it works. Stanley chose that moment to commit. His forces hit Richard's charge from the flank. Richard was pulled from his horse and killed. The last English king to die in battle. Henry Tudor became king because one man decided to stop waiting. He understood this completely. He knew that the same calculation that won him Bosworth could be made the other direction by the next ambitious lord with an army. So he built. What Henry VII built was not a glorious court or a military empire. It was a system, a machine for turning uncertainty into control. He was obsessed with money in a way his contemporaries found slightly embarrassing, and historians have come to recognize as genius. An empty treasury was a vulnerable throne. He filled it and kept it filled, collecting revenue with a focus that never relaxed, hiring financial administrators of real ability and holding them to account. He used the legal system to fine nobles who stepped out of line, turning justice into revenue. He accumulated a surplus that no English king in living memory had managed. He built a spy network. He wanted to know what people were saying about him, who was meeting with whom, which foreign courts were entertaining pretenders. The information came back through a web of informants that reached into noble households and foreign embassies. He remembered everything. He trusted almost no one. The pretenders came anyway. Lambert Simnel was put forward as a Yorkist heir, led a rebellion, and was defeated. Henry's response was calculated. He pardoned the boy and put him to work in the royal kitchens. The message was clear. This pretender is so unthreatening, I can afford to be merciful. Come see him turning a spit over the fire. Perkin Warbeck was more serious. He claimed to be Richard of York, one of the princes who had disappeared in the Tower during Richard III's reign. And he was convincing enough that the courts of France, Burgundy, and Scotland welcomed him as a useful tool against England. For nearly a decade, Warbeck haunted Henry's reign, a ghost with real political consequences. Henry eventually caught him, imprisoned him, and executed him when he tried to escape. But the years of Warbeck's existence had cost Henry something money could not replace. The comfortable certainty that tomorrow would look like today. There is a portrait of Henry VII in which he looks out with pale, watchful eyes and an expression that suggests he is calculating something even as you look at him. The coldness in that face was not a character flaw. It was armor. It was what happened to a man who had lived in exile for half his life, won a kingdom by the slimmest of margins, and knew better than anyone how quickly a crown could change heads. He died in April of 1509, 52 years old. The treasury was full. The dynasty seemed secure. His son would inherit a kingdom in better shape than England had seen in decades. Along with all the money and all the systems and all the careful machinery of control that Henry had spent 24 years building, his son would also inherit the fear, and Henry VIII would do something with that fear his father never imagined. He would set the world on fire trying to outrun it. January 1486. 5 months after Bosworth. Snow on the ground in London. Henry Tudor married Elizabeth of York in Westminster Abbey, and the city celebrated with the intensity of people who have been holding their breath for a very long time and have finally been given permission to exhale. Bonfires in the streets, music in the taverns. The particular joy that comes not from happiness exactly, but from relief. 30 years of civil war. 30 years of switching sides and burning crops and watching neighbours hang for backing the wrong king. And now, the two houses that had been tearing England apart were being joined in one marriage. One bed. One bloodline. Someone in Henry's court came up with the Tudor rose. A red rose for Lancaster. A white rose for York. Merged into a single bloom. Red outside. White at the centre. A piece of political design so elegant it worked immediately. The way only the best propaganda works. By making people feel something true, even when the reality behind it was more complicated. The reality was always more complicated. Henry Tudor did not marry Elizabeth of York because he loved her. He married her because she was the daughter of Edward IV, the last strong Yorkist king. And by marrying her, he absorbed the Yorkist claim into his own bloodline. Any child born of this marriage would carry both Lancaster and York. Any rebellion launched in the name of York would be a rebellion against itself. It was a masterstroke of political engineering, dressed in wedding clothes. Elizabeth of York was 20 years old when she married Henry, and she had already survived more than most people twice her age. Her father died when she was 17. Her younger brother became Edward V for about 2 months before their uncle Richard took the throne, and both boys disappeared into the Tower of London and were never seen again. Elizabeth had watched her family destroyed, had lived through the period when Richard III declared her illegitimate, when her identity as a royal princess was legally erased. She had come back from that. She had a gift that Henry did not possess and knew he did not possess. When she rode through London, the crowds cheered for her with genuine feeling. She made people feel seen. Henry's subjects respected him the way they respected a tax collector. His wife, they actually loved. He needed her for it. And he knew that too. The marriage produced children with the speed that a dynasty under pressure required. Arthur came first. In September of 1486, named for the legendary British king, a name chosen to announce that this was not just a new dynasty, but a restoration of something ancient. The name said we were always supposed to be here. Margaret came next, then Henry, then Mary, several others who did not survive infancy. Because infancy in the 15th century was a killing field that no amount of royal wealth could protect against. But the dynasty had its heirs. Arthur, to carry the crown. Henry, as the spare. Then, in February of 1503, Elizabeth of York went into labour with her 8th child. She was 37. The birth went wrong in the way that births went wrong in the 16th century. In the way that medicine had no answer for and no warning of. The baby, a girl named Catherine, survived a week. Elizabeth survived 9 days. She died on her 37th birthday, the 11th of February, 1503. Henry VII, who had spent 17 years using his wife as a political instrument with cold precision, fell apart. He withdrew from public life. He shut himself in his chambers. He turned away visitors. The man who had held England together through pretenders and rebellions and financial crises with the steady composure of a machine was brought to his knees by grief in a way that nothing else had managed. It tells you something important, not just about Henry, but about what the marriage had become beneath the political surface. Whatever calculations had produced it, it had turned into something real. Elizabeth of York had been the one person in Henry Tudor's world that he allowed himself to need. Without her, he hardened. The final 6 years of his reign were darker than what came before, more suspicious, more aggressive in his financial demands, more isolated. The warmth Elizabeth had given the court disappeared with her. He still had Arthur. He still had the dynasty. He thought, 5 weeks after Elizabeth died. Something happened at a cold castle on the Welsh border that would unravel everything Henry VII had built. Arthur Tudor got sick. Ludlow Castle sits on a hill above the River Thames in the Welsh Marches. And in the spring of 1502, it was the residence of the Prince of Wales and his new wife. Arthur Tudor had married Catherine of Aragon in November of 1501. She was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, the two most powerful monarchs in Europe. The king and queen who had just finished conquering Granada and were in the process of funding a Genoese sailor named Columbus. A marriage between their daughter and the heir to the English throne was a statement about where England now stood in the world. Henry VII had spent years negotiating it. The dowry alone had filled volumes of diplomatic correspondence. Arthur was 15. Catherine was 16. They had met in person a few weeks before the wedding. By all accounts, they liked each other, or at least appeared to, which in royal marriages was considered close enough to the same thing. After the London celebrations, the young couple was sent to Ludlow to begin learning the administration of Wales and the Marches, the traditional education of a Prince of Wales in his duties. It was cold in Ludlow that winter. The castle was draughty in the way of old stone buildings, and the Welsh border country had a damp that settled in your bones and stayed there. In March of 1502, Arthur got sick. Whatever it was moved fast. Within weeks it was clear this was not a passing fever. Catherine caught it too, but recovered. Arthur did not. He died on the 2nd of April, 1502. He was 15 years old. He had been Prince of Wales his entire life and married for 5 months. A messenger rode through the night to London. The king's confessor was sent to break the news. Henry received it with remarkable outward calm. Then he sent for his wife. Elizabeth came to him, and in that room, in the dark hours of the morning, two people who had spent their entire marriage being careful and political in front of the world held on to each other and wept. Now sit with what that death actually meant. Arthur was the heir. He had been prepared, educated, named for legends, married to Spain, trained from birth for the specific weight of the crown. His younger brother Henry, 10 years old at the time, had been raised for a different life. He had been given the broad education of a younger son, languages and music and theology, the kind of education that suited a boy who might serve the church or a university or a great household. Henry had not been prepared for the crown, and Catherine of Aragon was a widow at 16 in a foreign country. Henry VII did not send her home. The practical reason was money. Spain had paid only half of Catherine's dowry before the wedding, with the rest to follow in installments. If Catherine returned to Spain, there would be lengthy and painful negotiations about what England owed and what Spain owed and whether any of the original dowry needed to come back. Henry VII had spent 2 decades building a surplus 1 coin at a time. He was not going to watch money walk out the door on a Spanish ship. So Catherine stayed. She existed in a kind of administrative limbo for the better part of 7 years. Not quite a princess. Not quite a widow. Not quite a guest. Her allowance was cut. Her household shrank. She wrote to her parents describing real financial hardship, pawning jewelry to pay her servants. Ferdinand and Isabella sent sympathy but not much else. Another idea floated through the Tudor court. never quite decided upon, never quite abandoned. Henry VII himself briefly considered marrying Catherine. He was a widower. She was young and healthy, and her connection to Spain still had value. The idea was discussed and eventually dropped. The remaining option was the younger son, Henry, who by 1503 was 12 years old and already showing signs of becoming something his father was not. Tall even as a boy, loud where his father was quiet, confident where his father was careful. A papal dispensation was sought to allow Henry to marry his brother's widow. The theological question it raised, whether a man could marry his brother's wife, would one day tear Europe apart. But in 1503, it was answered without much difficulty. Pope Julius II granted the dispensation. The betrothal was arranged. Catherine of Aragon would be Queen of England after all, just with a different Tudor. Here is the thing that most people never fully appreciate about the death of Arthur Tudor. If Arthur lives, Henry stays a younger son. He never sits on the throne. There is no crisis of succession. No desperate search for a male heir from a second marriage. No Anne Boleyn. No break with Rome. No Church of England. No reformation of the particular English flavour that would eventually produce the dissenters who would board ships and sail west. One boy died of a fever in a Welsh castle in the spring of 1502, and the world that you and I live in became possible. Catherine did not know any of that as she waited in England through those 7 years of reduced circumstances and uncertain status. She prayed. She read. She wore the same dresses until they wore out. She was waiting for her life to begin again. She did not know the man she was waiting for would become the greatest crisis of her existence, that the son she could not give him would cost her everything. She just waited. The clock was ticking, and nobody could hear it yet. April 1509. Henry VII died on the 21st of that month, and within hours the mood in London changed in a way that people who lived through it spent years trying to describe. It was not just relief. It was something closer to the feeling of a window thrown open in a room that has been shut too long. The new king was 17 years old. The Venetian ambassador, a man paid to be accurate rather than flattering, wrote back to his government with the kind of description that reads almost like disbelief. He wrote that the king was the most handsome royal personage he had ever set eyes on, above the usual height, with an extremely fine calf to his leg, his complexion fair and bright, with auburn hair combed short in the French fashion. He wore a doublet of raised gold, a red mantle lined with white ermine, a collar from which hung a diamond the size of a walnut. This was not a description of a king. It was a description of an idea, of a king, the thing a king was supposed to be, made flesh, placed on a horse, and sent through the streets of London to remind everyone why monarchy existed. Henry could ride. He could joust. He played the lute with genuine skill and composed music. His court actually sought out and enjoyed, rather than merely tolerated. He spoke Latin, French, and Spanish with fluency. He wrote poetry. He danced well enough that people watched him dance, even when they did not have to. He came to the throne with something his father had spent 24 years trying to manufacture through legal instruments and spy networks and financial systems. He came with confidence, the instinctive, unquestioned certainty that he belonged exactly where he was, that the crown on his head was not a prize he had scrambled for, but simply his natural condition. His father had been terrified of losing the throne every day of his reign. His son did not appear to know what that felt like. Not yet. Thomas Wolsey was already in the room. a butcher's son from Ipswich, who had climbed through the church on intelligence and ambition alone, who was manoeuvring himself into the position of the man who would actually run England, while the king played tennis and organised jousting tournaments. Because that was the other thing about the young Henry that nobody quite said plainly. He did not like the grinding daily work of governance, the reading of reports, the signing of letters, the sitting through council meetings that stretched for hours over questions of customs duties and border disputes. His father had treated that work with the reverence of a man who knew the details were where kingdoms were won and lost. His son wanted the crown without the desk. Wolsey was happy to provide the desk. The arrangement worked in the early years. Henry got the glory. Wolsey got the power. England got governed. Henry fought a war in France in 1513, because fighting France was what English kings did, and he intended to be one in every particular. The campaign produced a victory at the Battle of the Spurs, named because the French cavalry retreated fast enough that people joked they left spur marks in the air. It was not a significant military achievement, but it gave Henry what he wanted, which was a story about himself he could tell at banquets. Back home that same summer, Catherine of Aragon served as regent while Henry was in France. When a Scottish army invaded from the north, as Scottish armies tended to do when English kings were occupied elsewhere, Catherine organised the response. The Scots were crushed at the Battle of Flodden. The Scottish king died on that field. Catherine wrote to Henry with the news and reportedly sent him the coat the Scottish king had died in. The letter was warm and almost cheerful. The letter of a woman who had just won a military victory and wanted her husband to know she was capable of more than he perhaps expected. Henry was delighted. He had a queen who was smart and brave and beloved by the English people, a cardinal who ran the government, a kingdom prosperous and mostly at peace, a reputation in Europe as the embodiment of Renaissance kingship. One problem: Catherine had been pregnant 4 times in the first 4 years of the marriage. A son named Henry, born in January of 1511, lived 52 days. The others did not survive delivery. In 1515, another pregnancy. The child did not survive. In 1516, a healthy girl. They named her Mary. Henry held his daughter and told Catherine they were young and sons would follow. He was 25 years old, and he believed it. He kept believing it for 12 more years, through miscarriages and stillbirths and the slow grinding erosion of hope. Through the years, when Catherine's pregnancies stopped altogether, and the biological reality of what that meant settled over the court like weather, and as the years passed and no son came, the belief curdled into something that could not be satisfied with patience or prayer, something that needed a different kind of answer. In a French court, at approximately this time, a young English woman with dark eyes and an intelligence that made rooms pay attention was learning to navigate power with the instincts of someone who had been watching how the world worked and taking notes. Her name was Anne Boleyn. She was coming home. There is a letter in the Vatican archives, written in Spanish, in a hand still recognizable as educated and precise after 500 years, addressed to Henry VIII, King of England. It begins with the words, "My most dear Lord and husband." It was written by a woman who had been told by the man she was addressing that she was no longer his wife, that their marriage had never been valid, that she should stop calling herself Queen and accept the title of Princess Dowager, widow of Prince Arthur, which was what Henry's lawyers were now arguing she had always been. She signed it, Catherine the Queen, not former Queen, not Princess Dowager. Catherine the Queen. She would sign every letter that way until she died. She would insist on the title in every legal proceeding, every communication, every conversation. When Henry sent representatives to negotiate with her, she received them as a queen receives diplomats. When they told her the Pope might rule against her, she said she would wait for that ruling and appeal it, and then appeal again, for as long as it took, because she knew she was right, and she intended to behave accordingly. Catherine of Aragon is remembered, when she is remembered at all, as the first wife, the sympathetic victim in the opening act of the Henry VIII story, present mainly to make Anne Boleyn's arrival more dramatic. That is not who she was. She was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, who had unified Spain, expelled the Moors from Granada, and sent Columbus across the Atlantic. She had inherited everything. She spoke Latin, French, and Spanish. She understood politics the way other people understood weather, and when Henry VIII told her their marriage was over, she fought him with everything she had. The legal and theological battle that consumed 7 years, the thing historians call the great matter, began with a question that sounds simple and was not. Henry argued that his marriage to Catherine had never been valid because she had first been married to his brother Arthur. Leviticus forbade a man from taking his brother's wife. The papal dispensation granted in 1503 had not had the authority to override Scripture. Therefore their marriage was void. Therefore Mary was illegitimate. Therefore Henry was free to marry again. Catherine's response was equally direct. She had been a virgin when she married Henry. Her marriage to Arthur, which lasted 5 months and ended with Arthur too sick to do much of anything, did not constitute the kind of union Leviticus was addressing. The dispensation was valid. The marriage was valid. She was queen, and she was going to keep saying so until someone with the authority to rule on the matter agreed with her. That someone was Pope Clement VII. Clement did not want to rule against Henry. Henry was a significant political figure, and the papacy valued that relationship. But Clement could not rule in Henry's favour either. In May of 1527, the troops of the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, had sacked Rome. They had occupied the city, killed thousands, and made the Pope effectively a prisoner. Charles was Catherine's nephew. Clement was trapped between 2 powerful men and had no safe move. So he did what trapped men do. He delayed. He convened hearings. He sent legates to England to examine the case. He asked for more time, and more time, and more time, until Henry ran out of patience entirely and decided to solve the problem himself. Meanwhile, Catherine endured. After Mary, in 1516, there were more pregnancies. None produced a living child. Catherine was in her 30s, then her 40s. The court watched and understood and said nothing plainly. She was still queen. She insisted on that, but the court was already shifting around her. Looking toward the future, Henry was trying to force into existence. He asked her more than once to simply agree, to accept that the marriage was invalid, to retire to a convent with a generous income, to release him quietly. He put it to her as a practical matter. She refused. Every time. Without ambiguity, she refused because she believed she was right. But she also refused because agreeing meant something specific that she could not accept. If the marriage was invalid, Mary was illegitimate. She would take Mary, the child she had carried and loved and fought for, and reduce her to a bastard with no place in the succession. Catherine would endure almost anything for herself. She would not do that to her daughter. Henry moved her from palace to palace, reducing her household, restricting her access to Mary, cutting her allowance, trying to wear down her resistance through isolation and discomfort. She was moved eventually to Kimbolton Castle, a gloomy place far from London, and she spent her final years there, increasingly ill, increasingly alone. She and Mary were never permitted to see each other again. Catherine asked repeatedly. Henry refused each time. She died at Kimbolton on the 7th of January, 1536, 50 years old, in her final letter to Henry, written when she was too weak to hold the pen properly. She wrote that she forgave him everything and that her eyes desired him above all things. When Henry received the news, he dressed in yellow and held a celebration. Yellow was the Tudor colour of joy, whether he was celebrating Catherine's death or performing celebration to signal the matter was closed, or simply relieved in a way that bypassed all the complicated feelings underneath. Nobody was sure then. Nobody is sure now. What is certain is this: Catherine of Aragon was the first great obstacle Henry VIII encountered in his life. The first person who stood in the way of what he wanted and simply refused to move. Her refusal did not stop him. In 7 years he had broken England from Rome, destroyed one cardinal, built a new administrative machine, and found a new woman to replace her. But the 7 years cost him. The decisions he made in those 7 years changed everything, in ways that would keep changing long after both Henry and Catherine were in the ground. He had met Anne Boleyn, and nothing after that was going to be the same. Sometime around 1525, at a court entertainment at Greenwich Palace, Henry VIII noticed Anne Boleyn. He had noticed her before, in the way powerful men at Tudor courts noticed young women, as a passing thing that cost nothing and meant nothing. Her sister Mary had been his mistress for a period in the early 1520s, a fact everyone at court knew and nobody put in writing if they could help it. Anne had spent years at the French court and recently returned to England, where she served as a lady-in-waiting to Catherine of Aragon. She was dark, where the English fashion favoured fair, slender when roundness was considered beautiful. By the standards of her time, she was not conventionally pretty, but she moved differently than other women at court. Contemporaries struggled to describe it and kept trying anyway. The French ambassador wrote that she had a great deal of charm and that her eyes were especially beautiful, dark and inviting, and could be used with effect. The poet Thomas Wyatt circled around her in verse like a man who knows he cannot have something and cannot stop thinking about it. She played the lute and sang. She danced with a precision that made watching her a different experience than watching other people dance. She spoke with a directness that was startling in a world where women in her position were expected to be decorative and agreeable. She was neither. Henry began pursuing her the way he had pursued her sister, with gifts and attention and the unspoken understanding that a king's interest was not really a request. Anne did something no one in her position had managed successfully before. She said no, not no to Henry personally. She engaged with him, debated him, wrote him letters that were clever and warm, and kept him interested without giving him what he was asking for. What she declined was the role. She was not going to be a royal mistress. She had watched what happened to women who took that position. Her own sister had been Henry's mistress and been quietly set aside when his interest moved on, left with a pension and a diminished reputation and no particular future. Anne had no interest in that outcome. If she was going to enter Henry's orbit, she was going to do it, on terms she set. The terms she had in mind were not small. The 17 letters Henry wrote to Anne that survive, found centuries later in the Vatican archives, where Anne apparently sent them for safekeeping, are among the most remarkable documents in English royal history. Henry VIII, King of England, writing actual love letters, not diplomatic correspondence dressed in romantic language, but the real thing, urgent and sometimes almost desperate, from a man who could not understand why he was not getting what he wanted. He wrote that he had been struck for more than a year by the dart of love and was not yet sure whether he would fail or find a place in her heart. He drew a heart around his initials and hers. He sent gifts, jewelry, a buck he had killed hunting, a small portrait of himself. He wrote in French and in English with a vulnerability he showed to no one else, that no other document from his life comes close to matching. He was completely in love with her, and Anne, who was not helplessly anything, kept him exactly where she wanted him. The simpler version of Anne Boleyn makes her a schemer who trapped the king into marriage. That version flatters nobody and explains nothing. What she was doing was more interesting and more dangerous than scheming. She was operating in the only way available to a woman of her intelligence and ambition, in a system that offered women no formal power at all. She was using the one resource she controlled, which was access to herself, to negotiate for the only position that would give her any security. She wanted to be queen, not from greed, from understanding. A mistress could be discarded. A queen was harder to remove. And a queen, who gave Henry the son Catherine had not given him, would be, she calculated, unremovable entirely. The calculation was correct. What she could not fully account for was the way Henry's feelings would eventually become the most dangerous thing about her situation, rather than the most protective. There was something else about Anne that the standard story underplays. She had genuine, reformist religious convictions, considerably more Protestant in their direction than the official position of the English Church. She had spent years in France where evangelical ideas about scripture and church authority circulated among educated people, with a freedom England had not yet permitted. She owned books that were on the Church's list of prohibited texts. She had access to English translations of scripture that the church authorities were trying to suppress because they allowed ordinary people to read the Bible in their own language without priestly mediation. And she introduced Henry to people who thought in reforming ways about the church and its relationship to royal authority. Whether this was strategy or genuine conviction is a question historians have never fully settled. Probably it was both, woven so tightly that Anne herself may not have been able to separate them. What matters is what it set in motion. Cromwell was in the room during these years, watching from the edge of it. He had come into royal service through Wolsey, had made himself useful in ways that the rest of the court found slightly unsettling. He was a lawyer's son who had spent years in Italy working in banking and trade before returning to England to practice law and find his way into the Cardinal's household. He was not elegant, not charming in the way Wolsey was charming. He watched people with an attentiveness that made them uncomfortable, and he remembered everything. He had concluded. Watching Henry's frustration with Rome and Catherine's immovable resistance and Wolsey's increasingly desperate attempts to find a solution within the existing system, that the existing system was the problem. Henry did not need a better argument to put before the Pope. He needed to make the Pope irrelevant. That idea was forming in Cromwell's mind as he watched the most powerful man in England pursue a woman who kept saying no. Anne held Henry at arm's length for approximately 6 years. 6 years of letters and gifts and conversations, and the particular torture of wanting something completely and being prevented from having it by the intelligence and will of the very thing you want. For a man of his appetites and his options, the faithfulness alone tells you something about what she meant to him. In the autumn of 1532, Henry took Anne to France with him on a diplomatic visit, presenting her publicly as his companion. When they returned to England, the thing that had not happened in 6 years finally happened. They became lovers. By January of 1533, Anne was pregnant. Henry married her in secret. Probably in November of 1532, Archbishop Cranmer declared Henry's marriage to Catherine void. In May of 1533, Anne was publicly crowned queen in June, in a ceremony that half the population of London watched in silence rather than with the cheering that traditionally accompanied such events. The silence was noticed. Henry noticed it. Anne noticed it. Neither said anything about it publicly. In September of 1533, Anne gave birth. The baby was healthy and strong. The astrologers had predicted a boy. The birth announcements, prepared in advance, used the word prince. The baby was a girl. They named her Elizabeth. Henry forced a smile. Anne forced a smile. The court rearranged its expressions and said the right things. And underneath the smiling and the right things, in the silence that lived between what people said and what they meant, the clock that had been ticking since the death of Arthur Tudor ticked a little louder. York Place, London, autumn 1529. Thomas Wolsey stood in a palace that was no longer his and watched them take the inventory. The tapestries were being catalogued. The silver counted. The rooms he had filled with the accumulated wealth of the most powerful churchmen in England were being emptied and refilled with the king's things. The palace itself was about to be renamed Whitehall and become the primary royal residence of England. Wolsey was being sent north to York, the diocese he had nominally led for years without ever visiting, to concern himself with his ecclesiastical duties and stay out of politics. He was 60 years old, and he had nothing left. 18 years he had spent making himself indispensable. 18 years of managing wars and treaties and the daily machinery of a kingdom, while the king hunted and jousted and pursued Anne Boleyn. He had risen from a butcher's son in Ipswich to Archbishop of York, Cardinal, Lord Chancellor, the man who received foreign ambassadors and ran the government and built Hampton Court so magnificently that he had to give it to Henry as a gift to avoid the obvious awkwardness of a servant living better than his master. And he had failed to deliver the one thing Henry wanted, the annulment, the legal end of the marriage to Catherine that would free Henry to marry Anne and get his son. Wolsey had tried. He had convened hearings, dispatched diplomats, argued theology with papal legates, spent years finding paths through the maze of canon law and papal politics and Catherine's immovable resistance. He had found no path because no path existed within the system he was working in. The Pope could not grant what Henry wanted. That was the irreducible fact. And Wolsey, whose entire career had been built on his ability to make things happen through the institutions of church and state, was helpless before an irreducible fact. Anne Boleyn's family pushed against him too. Her father and her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, had their own reasons to want Wolsey gone. Anne herself had a long memory. Wolsey had once worked to prevent her relationship with Henry from developing, had tried to arrange a different match for her. She had Henry's ear in a way nobody else did. Henry let them push. Wolsey died in November of 1530 on his way to London to face trial for treason. He collapsed at Leicester Abbey and died there. sparing himself the spectacle of whatever came next. His reported last words were, "If I had served God as diligently as I have served the king, he would not have abandoned me in my grey hairs." Whether he said exactly that is one of those questions history cannot settle. But the words, shaped or true, capture something real. Wolsey had given everything to royal service, and when it could not deliver one specific thing, it was discarded along with him. Thomas Cromwell watched this happen and drew conclusions. The conclusions were these: a man who served two masters, the king and the pope, would be torn apart when those masters disagreed. The answer was to eliminate one of them, the king's will, expressed through Parliament, enforced through the courts, administered through a bureaucracy answerable only to the crown, was the only authority that needed to exist in England. Cromwell entered royal service directly in the early 1530s and rose with a speed that astonished people who understood what they were watching. By 1532 he was the king's principal secretary. By 1533 he was Chancellor of the Exchequer. By 1534 he was the most powerful man in England after the king. He operated differently than Wolsey had operated. Wolsey had ruled by presence, by the overwhelming force of his personality and his access to Henry. When he was removed, the things he had managed stopped being managed, because so much of it had lived in his head and his relationships. Cromwell was building something that did not depend on his personal presence at every point. He reorganized the Privy Council into a functioning executive body with regular meetings and written records. He developed the Royal Secretariat into a professional administrative machine. He pushed legislation through Parliament that reformed the structure of English church and state, not by royal decree alone, but through parliamentary statute, giving the changes a legal permanence that decree alone could not provide. Parliament passed laws. The laws created institutions. The institutions were staffed by men appointed by the Crown. The Crown's power was extended not just for this reign, but into every future reign, into the permanent architecture of the state. He also built intelligence networks that Walsingham would later perfect. He wanted to know where resistance was forming before it formed completely, so he could address it before it became a crisis. Now, picture what all of this meant for one specific person. In a village in Yorkshire, a monk named William had lived in the same Benedictine monastery for 30 years. He had entered as a young man, and the monastery had been his entire world. The rhythm of prayer, marking every hour. The community of men around him who had made the same choice. The land they farmed, and the books they copied, and the poor of the parish who came to the monastery gate when the harvest failed. He had no other life. He had not needed one. In 1536, Cromwell's commissioners arrived with their ledgers. They catalogued the monastery's income and assets. They documented whatever failings they could find. William watched them move through the rooms he had lived in for 3 decades, writing things down in books that would determine whether his world continued to exist. The process took days. When they left, he knew what was coming. The smaller monasteries were dissolved first, then the larger ones. By 1540, 800 religious houses had been closed across England. Their lands, their buildings, their treasuries absorbed by the Crown and then sold. William received a small pension and was told he could no longer practice religious life in community. He walked out of the gate he had entered as a young man and stood in a world that had no particular place for him. The land his monastery had farmed was sold to a merchant from London, who converted the agricultural fields to sheep pasture, which was more profitable and required fewer workers. The poor of the parish, who had come to the monastery gate when times were hard, found the gate closed. There was nothing behind it anymore. This was the birth of modern England. Not in the grand gesture of a king breaking with Rome, in the slow accumulation of Cromwell's paperwork, in the ledgers and the legal instruments and the sales of land that created new owners with new interests in keeping things the way they now were. The men who bought former monastic estates at favorable prices were not going to support any return to a system that might require them to give those estates back. Cromwell had turned religious policy into real estate investment, and in doing so had made the Reformation something with constituencies rather than just a royal preference that could be reversed when the king changed his mind. He built it in 7 years, and he built it in the service of a king who was, at this precise moment, watching the woman he had broken his world for nurse, a daughter when he had wanted a son, and beginning to wonder, with the particular coldness of Henry Tudor, whether she was still the answer to his problems, or whether she had become one of them. Cromwell noticed this too. He noticed everything. Westminster, November 1534. The chamber was cold. The candles burned low. The men sitting in the House of Lords had just voted on something none of them fully understood yet. Not in the way you understand a thing, when you can see all its consequences laid out before you. They understood the words. The words were not complicated. The King of England was now the supreme head of the Church of England. The Pope had no authority here anymore. Rome was finished. What they could not see, sitting in that cold chamber, with the November dark pressing against the windows, was what those 15 words would eventually produce. The executions that would follow within months, the monasteries emptied and stripped within years, the generations of English families who would change how they prayed not once, but 3 times in a single lifetime, switching from Latin to English, and back to Latin, and back to English, again, depending on which Tudor was currently wearing the crown. The ships that would eventually leave English ports carrying people who had decided that even the Reformed Church was not reformed enough. The continent those ships would reach. The nation those people would build. They could not see any of that. They saw a king who wanted something, a minister who had found a way to give it to him, and a vote that had just cut a thread connecting England to Rome that had held for nearly 1,000 years. Pull on that thread, follow it back. Christianity came to England in the 6th century, carried by missionaries sent from Rome, and from that moment the English Church had been part of the Roman Church. English bishops confirmed by Rome, English marriages and inheritances with religious dimensions, settled in church courts, answering ultimately to canon law interpreted in Rome. English kings had fought with popes before, spectacularly sometimes, but those conflicts had always been resolved within the system. The system itself was never in question. Henry put the system itself in question. The personal reason was Catherine. The marriage Rome would not end. The political reason was sovereignty. A king who could not control appointments and revenues and legal decisions within his own kingdom was not truly sovereign. The money flowing to Rome through church taxation, the legal cases going to Rome on appeal, the bishops whose ultimate loyalty was to a foreign power. All of it represented a limit on English royal authority that Cromwell in particular found intolerable. The theological reason is the one that gets misunderstood most often. Henry did not become a Protestant in 1534. The Church of England that came into existence through the Act of Supremacy was, in its theology, its liturgy, its sacraments, almost identical to the Roman Church it had just separated from. The Mass was still in Latin. Priests were still celibate. Transubstantiation was still the official doctrine. What changed was authority, not theology. England had a new head of its church. Everything else stayed largely the same. For now, the Protestant ideas spreading through Europe since Martin Luther in 1517 were circulating in England. Finding readers among scholars and merchants and reformers, the break with Rome created a space in which those ideas could move more freely, because the institutional force that had suppressed them was now cut off at the border. But Henry himself remained, in his own understanding, a Catholic king who happened to be head of his own national church. He would execute Protestants for heresy on the same days he executed Catholics for refusing to acknowledge his supremacy. He was entirely consistent about this. What the break produced in the short term was not a Protestant England. It produced an England in motion, an England whose religious identity was suddenly up for negotiation in a way it had never been before. And the negotiation, as negotiations involving questions of God and salvation tend to do, would get very bloody before it was finished. Go back to William, the monk in Yorkshire, whose monastery Cromwell's commissioners dissolved the Sunday after he left the monastery. William walked to his parish church. The service was the same as it had always been, in Latin, the same liturgy his grandparents had known. But something had changed, and he felt it without being able to name it precisely. The thread connecting this village church to Rome, to the community of faith that stretched across all of Christendom, had been cut by a law passed in London because the king wanted to end his marriage. For most ordinary English people in the 1530s, the Reformation did not feel like liberation. It felt like disruption. An authority that had organized meaning and time and community for 1,000 years suddenly gone, replaced by something still being worked out in Westminster that had not yet arrived in Yorkshire with any coherence. The working out would take decades and would go through several more violent turns. And the people who found themselves unable to accept whatever settlement emerged, who kept insisting that something more thoroughgoing was required, who grew up in this atmosphere of religious instability and concluded that the answer lay in a more complete and rigorous Protestantism than England seemed willing to embrace. Those people would eventually leave. In 1620, a ship called the Mayflower left England, carrying among its passengers a group of separatists, English Protestants who had concluded that the Church of England was still too corrupt, too connected to the old forms. They were people who had followed the logic of the Reformation further than Henry ever intended it to go, who believed the only way to build a true church was to start fresh, somewhere with no history to overcome. The somewhere they chose was a coastline in the Western Atlantic that had no English name yet. Henry VIII wanted to end his marriage. He broke with Rome to do it. He could not have imagined, sitting in his palaces in 1534, feeling the particular satisfaction of a man who has just solved a problem that has been frustrating him for 7 years, that the consequence of his solution would include a nation on the other side of the ocean that did not yet exist. The thread he pulled did not stop where he expected it to stop. It has not stopped yet. Tower Hill, July 1535. The crowd that gathered to watch Thomas More die was large and quiet. London crowds were not usually quiet at executions. They brought food and drink and commentary. They cheered or booed, depending on their sympathies. But More was different. He had been Lord Chancellor of England, one of the most famous scholars in Europe, a friend of Erasmus, the author of Utopia, a man whose learning and character had given him an international reputation for 30 years. People had come from a distance to watch him die, and many of them were not entirely sure how to feel about it. More climbed the scaffold with the assistance of a guard, because it was poorly built and slightly unsteady. He turned to the guard and said, "See me safe up. For my coming down, let me shift for myself." Then he knelt, prayed, adjusted the block, and told the executioner to wait a moment while he moved his beard out of the way, because his beard had committed no treason. Then he put his head down, and the axe fell. The joke about the beard is in the historical record, passed down through witnesses. It matters because of what it tells you about the man who made it. More went to his execution, making a joke, not from bravado, and not because he was performing courage for the crowd, but because he had thought carefully about how to die and had decided to do it as he had tried to live, with his intelligence intact and his composure not surrendered to the institution that was killing him. He had done nothing, in any conventional sense, to deserve death. He had not plotted against the king. He had not raised troops or written pamphlets or organized resistance. He had resigned the chancellorship quietly when royal policy moved in ways his conscience could not follow, retired to his home in Chelsea, and kept his opinions about the act of supremacy entirely to himself. He had attended Anne Boleyn's coronation, which surprised people who knew his views. He had held his peace. The problem was that Henry needed more to do more than hold his peace. He needed more to swear the oath that Parliament required of the king's subjects, to publicly affirm the supremacy, to align himself with the new order. More's silence was not neutral in Henry's reading of it. It was a refusal dressed in the clothing of discretion, and it was recognizable as such by everyone who understood anything about Thomas More. He was eventually arrested, brought to the Tower, and subjected to interrogations in which royal commissioners tried every available argument to get him to swear. He met every argument with the same response. He was willing to swear to the succession, to acknowledge the legitimacy of Henry's children by Anne. He was not willing to swear to the supremacy, because to do so would violate his understanding of what the universal church was and who could lead it. He would not say this plainly in any form that could be written down and used against him. He maintained his silence on the specific point. Under the law, as it existed in 1535, silence was not enough to convict him. So Richard Rich, the Solicitor General, testified at More's trial that More had told him privately that Parliament could not make the king head of the church. More denied this in open court, pointing out that Rich's reputation for truthfulness was not especially strong. The jury convicted anyway. The outcome had been determined before the trial began. 3 weeks earlier, Bishop John Fisher of Rochester had been executed on the same hill for the same refusal. Fisher was 80 years old, nearly blind. So weak he had to be carried to the scaffold. He had been Catherine of Aragon's most vocal defender throughout the great matter, a man of genuine learning and genuine principle who had made himself an obstacle to everything Henry was trying to do. More died on the 6th of July, 1535. Fisher had died on the 22nd of June. 2 men, one old and frail, one in the middle of his life, both refusing to say one thing that Henry needed them to say, both dead for that refusal. The executions sent a signal through educated Europe that was felt far beyond England. Erasmus was devastated. The humanist networks that had placed such hope in the new generation of Renaissance princes received the news with something like despair. This was not what learning and reform were supposed to produce. The signal Henry intended was different and more local. It was sent to every man of consequence in England who had reservations about the new order and was calculating how much those reservations were worth to him. The answer the executions provided was simple. Your reservations are worth your life. If you let them show, most men chose accordingly. Then came Anne Boleyn. In the 3 years since her coronation, Anne had not delivered the son. That was the entire point of everything that had been destroyed to make her queen. Elizabeth, born in 1533, was healthy. A pregnancy in 1534 ended in what appeared to be a miscarriage or stillbirth. In January of 1536, the same month, Catherine of Aragon died. Anne miscarried again. The child appeared to be male. Henry was in a jousting tournament that day. He was thrown from his horse and lay unconscious for 2 hours. When he recovered, he went to Anne's rooms and told her, by the account of witnesses, that he could see God would not give them male children. Then he left. Something shifted in Henry after that. Something in how he looked at Anne, in how the court reorganized itself around the question of what came next, in the calculations that people like Cromwell were making about the future. Cromwell had built his position on his ability to give Henry what Henry wanted. Henry had wanted Anne. Cromwell had helped construct the legal and institutional framework that made her queen. But now Henry wanted a son, and Anne was not providing one. The political landscape Cromwell had built with such care was tilting in a direction he needed to manage. There was also the practical matter that Anne had made powerful enemies. The Duke of Norfolk, her own uncle, had turned against her. The conservative faction at court, men who had grudgingly accepted the break with Rome, but disliked the reformist direction of Anne's influence, saw her as an obstacle to a more stable settlement. Foreign policy considerations pointed toward a new wife from a European royal house. Anne could not provide what such a wife would bring. Cromwell began to build a case. The speed of what happened next is one of the things that most unsettles historians. In late April of 1536, a musician named Mark Smeaton was arrested and, under circumstances that strongly suggest torture, confessed to having had relations with the Queen. Within days, 4 other men were arrested on the same charges, including Sir Henry Norris, one of Henry's closest companions, and Anne's own brother George Boleyn. The charge against George was incest. Anne was arrested on the 2nd of May and taken to the Tower. Things she said in distress and confusion during interrogation were written down and used against her. She was tried before a panel of peers that included her uncle Norfolk, who wept during the verdict. She was found guilty of adultery, incest, and conspiracy to murder the king. Most historians who have examined the evidence find it unconvincing. The dates in the indictment are wrong in several cases, placing Anne in locations she demonstrably was not. The men accused with her, except Smeaton, who had confessed under duress, maintained their innocence to their deaths. Anne maintained her innocence from her arrest to the scaffold. Cromwell had built a case that served its purpose, which was not historical truth, but the removal of Anne from the board in a way that left Henry's hands legally clean. The men accused with Anne were executed on the 17th of May, 1536. Anne was executed 2 days later on Tower Green. Within the Tower precincts, the privacy was unusual and was itself a kind of mercy, sparing her the public scaffold that More and Fisher and her alleged lovers had faced. She had requested a swordsman from France rather than the traditional English axe, because she had heard the French method was cleaner and faster. The request was granted. The swordsman came from Calais. She gave a short speech from the scaffold. She spoke well of the king. She asked for prayers. She expressed herself ready to die. Her ladies removed her headdress. She put her head down. The French sword swept through in a single stroke. She was approximately 35 years old. Henry was at Greenwich when it was done. A cannon fired from the tower as the signal. Within hours, he was dressed in white, the Tudor colour of joy. The next morning he was betrothed to Jane Seymour. 11 days later, they were married. When the king controls both the crown and the conscience, what counts as treason? Thomas More had forced that question into the open with his silence and his jokes and his refusal to swear an oath he did not believe in. Henry had answered it with complete consistency across all of these deaths. Whatever the king decided it was, that was what counted as treason. The scaffold was not the end of anything. It was a demonstration, a proof that the new order was not negotiating with doubt. England absorbed it, the way England absorbed everything. The churches filled. The markets opened. People went about their lives in a country that was being remade around them by decisions made in palaces and courtrooms, without their consent, and often without their knowledge, into something that had never quite existed before. A nation with one authority, one head, one church, one law. A nation that was still figuring out what it believed. Hampton Court Palace, October 1537. The bells of London rang for 3 days. Bonfires burned in the streets. Strangers bought each other drinks in the taverns. The city celebrated with the intensity of people who had been waiting a very long time for something and had begun to wonder if it was ever going to arrive. After 28 years on the throne, after everything that had been broken and burned and executed to get here, Henry VIII finally had what he had been chasing since the first years of his reign. As Somme, Jane Seymour delivered a healthy boy on the 12th of October, 1537, at Hampton Court. They named him Edward. Henry wept when they told him. Grown men in the Tudor court did not weep in public, as a general rule. Henry wept anyway. 28 years of waiting had a weight to them, and the relief of that weight lifting all at once was apparently more than composure could contain. Jane Seymour had done what Catherine of Aragon could not do, and what Anne Boleyn had died trying to do. She had given England its prince. She was dead 12 days later. The birth had been long and difficult. And in the days that followed, something went wrong in the way things went wrong in the 16th century, in ways that medicine had no means to address. Likely puerperal fever, the infection that killed women in childbed with a regularity that no amount of royal wealth could prevent. Jane Seymour, who had been Queen of England for 17 months, who had sat at the edge of the storm that destroyed her predecessor, and waited for her moment with a patience that people around her sometimes mistook for simplicity, died on the 24th of October, 1537. Henry went into mourning, genuine mourning, visible in the body, in the face, in the withdrawal from ordinary life that real grief produces. He wore black for 3 months. He closed himself in his chambers. The court moved quietly around him, uncertain, watching for signals. He had loved Jane, or had loved what Jane represented, which in Henry's world had become the same thing. When Henry finally emerged, the ordinary business of being a king in the 16th century resumed. He needed another wife. A single male heir, an infant, was not a secure succession. Children died. Everyone knew children died. Edward needed a brother, and the only way to get one was another marriage. Cromwell was given the task of finding one. What followed tells you everything about how royal marriage worked in the Tudor period, and very little about anything resembling human feeling. Cromwell commissioned Hans Holbein, the greatest portrait painter in Europe, to travel to the courts of potential brides and paint their likenesses so Henry could evaluate his options with something like accuracy. Portraits arrived at court. Henry examined them. Diplomatic negotiations began with the families of the most promising candidates. The candidate Cromwell settled on was Anne of Cleves, the daughter of a German duke. A match that made political sense because an alliance with him served English interests in the complicated geography of Protestant German states. Holbein painted Anne. The portrait showed a pleasant, open face, well-dressed, dignified. Henry approved the portrait. The marriage was arranged. Anne arrived in England in December of 1539, and Henry, unable to contain his impatience, rode to Rochester to meet her before the formal reception. He wanted to see his bride with his own eyes. What happened at Rochester has been reported so many times that the specific words have taken on the quality of legend. What is certain is that Henry's reaction to meeting Anne in person was profoundly negative. He found her unattractive in a way the portrait had not prepared him for. The chemistry between them was entirely absent. He reportedly called her a Flanders mare, though whether those exact words were used or attached themselves to the story afterward is genuinely uncertain. He went through with the marriage in January of 1540 because backing out would have been a diplomatic catastrophe. The marriage was never consummated. Henry told his physicians that something in his nature simply would not cooperate. Anne of Cleves was Queen of England for 6 months. Then, Henry's lawyers negotiated an annulment. She was given several houses and a substantial income and the informal title of the king's beloved sister. She remained in England for the rest of her life, and by most accounts was quite content with the arrangement, which compared favourably to the alternatives available to women in her position. Cromwell was not as fortunate. The Anne of Cleves marriage was the mistake that destroyed him. He had staked his political reputation on this match, had pushed it through against the reservations of people who thought it was wrong, had managed the entire elaborate machinery of bringing a German princess to England to marry a king who turned out not to want her. The enemies Cromwell had accumulated over years of making himself the instrument of unpopular policies saw their moment. In June of 1540, Cromwell was arrested at the Privy Council table. The Duke of Norfolk removed the Order of the Garter from Cromwell's neck himself, while other council members stripped his remaining insignia. Cromwell slammed his hat on the ground and asked whether this was the reward for his services. Nobody answered. He was taken to the Tower. He wrote Henry a letter of extraordinary desperation, calling himself a most woeful prisoner and a most miserable man, asking for mercy with a directness that would have been beneath his dignity in any earlier period of his life. Henry used the letter and then signed the execution order. The man who had built the administrative and legal framework of the English Reformation, who had reorganized the government and dissolved the monasteries and served the king with an efficiency and loyalty that had no real precedent in English royal service, was beheaded on Tower Hill on the 28th of July, 1540. Henry later told people he regretted the execution, that Cromwell had been put to death on false accusations made by his enemies. He may have meant it. He had signed the order anyway. The same day, Cromwell was executed. Henry VIII married Catherine Howard. Catherine Howard was the niece of the Duke of Norfolk, who had helped arrange the match. She was probably still a teenager. Henry was 49, his leg chronically infected and painful, his weight enormous, his mobility limited. By any honest assessment, the match was not between equals, in any sense the word could be stretched to cover. Catherine had grown up in the large, loosely supervised household of the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. where young women came and went with limited oversight. She had had relationships before Henry. With a music teacher when she was perhaps 13 or 14, and with a young man named Francis Dereham afterward. These were not secrets in the household. They were simply not information anyone volunteered to the king when the match was being arranged. Henry was besotted with her in the way a man of his age and condition becomes besotted with youth and vitality. He called her his rose without a thorn. He gave her jewels and dresses and houses. He was visibly happier than he had been in years. It lasted approximately 18 months. The information about Catherine's past relationships surfaced in the autumn of 1541, brought to Archbishop Cranmer's attention and passed to Henry in a note left at his pew during Mass, because Cranmer lacked either the nerve or the cruelty to tell him face to face. Henry's initial reaction was disbelief, then investigation, then the particular rage of a man who has been made to look foolish in a way he cannot deny. Catherine tried to reach Henry after her arrest. She reportedly ran through the halls of Hampton Court toward the chapel where he was at prayer, screaming for him. The guards caught her before she reached the door. He did not open it. She was executed on Tower Green on the 13th of February, 1542. She was probably around 17 or 18 years old. The night before her execution, she asked that the block be brought to her room so she could practice laying her head on it correctly, because she wanted to die gracefully and was afraid she would not know how. A teenage girl practicing how to die so she could do it right. That is the thing that stays. Catherine Parr became Henry's sixth wife in July of 1543, and she was the one who outlived him. She was 31, twice widowed, educated, intelligent. With reformist religious sympathies, she had the judgment to express carefully rather than loudly. She was fond of Henry in the way you can be fond of someone you are slightly frightened of and have decided to manage rather than confront. She very nearly did not survive him. In 1546, with Henry in his final year, his health deteriorating, and his temper, accordingly, unreliable, Catherine had a theological argument with him about religion that went further than she intended. Someone in the conservative faction drew up a warrant for her arrest on charges of heresy. The warrant was signed. Catherine learned of it through some combination of luck and alertness. She went to Henry. She told him she had only argued theology to distract him from his pain and to benefit from his superior wisdom, that she had no opinions of her own, but bowed entirely to his judgment. Henry accepted it, called her his sweetheart. When the guards arrived the next day with the warrant, he sent them away himself, calling them knaves. Catherine Parr understood something about survival in the Tudor court that can be stated simply. The question was never whether you were right. The question was whether the king could be made to believe you were useful to him, or, at minimum, not threatening. She answered that question correctly every time until Henry died, and she was finally, permanently safe. 6 women, 2 executed, 2 divorced, 1 dead in childbed, 1 who outlived them all by knowing exactly when to stop talking. The arithmetic of Henry's marriages gets repeated so often, it starts to feel like trivia. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. But behind the mnemonic are 6 actual people who moved through the most dangerous court in Europe. Their value measured by their ability to produce a male child. Their safety entirely dependent on the continued favor of a man who had demonstrated, repeatedly, what happened when that favor ran out. The rose without a thorn turned out to have thorns after all. They always did. Whitehall Palace, January 1547. The king was dying, and nobody was allowed to say so. There was a law, the kind of law that only makes sense in a Tudor context, that made it treasonable to predict the death of the king. Predicting it could be construed as wishing for it, and wishing for the king's death was the kind of thought that the Tudor state had decided it needed to regulate. So as Henry VIII lay in Whitehall Palace in the final days of January 1547, enormous and immobile, his legs suppurating, his breathing laboured, the people around him maintained the polite fiction that he was not dying until the fiction became impossible to maintain. He was 55 years old. The man who had been described by the Venetian ambassador as the most handsome royal personage in Europe, the man who had jousted and hunted and danced with a physical exuberance that seemed to promise decades of vigorous kingship, had spent his final years being carried in a chair because he could not walk the length of a corridor. The jousting accident of 1536, which left him unconscious for 2 hours, had aggravated a leg wound that never properly healed. The wound became a chronic infection that produced a smell that people in his vicinity struggled to ignore. He had become, by the end, almost unrecognizably large. The suit of armor from his prime has a waist of 32 inches. The suit, made for his final years, has a waist of 52 inches. On the 27th of January, 1547, Henry was finally told he was dying, because it had become impossible to tell him anything else. He called for Thomas Cranmer, his Archbishop of Canterbury. Cranmer came and held his hand. Henry could no longer speak. Cranmer asked him to give some sign that he trusted in God's mercy. Henry squeezed his hand. That was the end. The death was kept secret for 3 days, while the council settled arrangements. Then it was announced. Henry VIII, who had reigned for 38 years, who had broken England from Rome and executed 2 queens and presided over the most thoroughgoing transformation of English religion and government in 1,000 years, was dead. His son was 9 years old. Edward VI had been prepared for this moment in theory. He was educated with the care that Henry's terror of dynastic failure had demanded, surrounded by the finest tutors, given a rigorous grounding in Latin, Greek, theology, history, and statecraft. He was, by every account, genuinely intelligent, quick to learn, with particular aptitude for languages and a seriousness about religion that went beyond what his tutors required. He believed in the Protestant Reformation with the fervour of a young person who has found a framework that makes the world make sense. He was also 9 years old, which meant the education had not yet had time to produce a king. It had produced a gifted child who understood what kings were supposed to be and knew very little about what it actually took to be one. The men who moved into the space that Edward's youth created were his maternal uncles, the brothers of Jane Seymour, who had positioned themselves carefully during the final years of Henry's reign in anticipation of exactly this moment. Edward Seymour, the elder brother, became Lord Protector and governed England in his nephew's name. He was given the title Duke of Somerset. Somerset had genuine Protestant convictions and saw himself as a reforming figure who would advance the Reformation further than Henry had been willing to go. He had a boy king who shared those convictions. Together they pushed the Church in England towards something more thoroughly Protestant than what Henry had left. The Book of Common Prayer, introduced in 1549, was the most visible expression of the Edwardian Reformation. It replaced the Latin Mass with an English-language liturgy written primarily by Cranmer, who turned out to be a prose stylist of extraordinary gift, producing language so deeply embedded in the rhythms of English that it would still be in use 4 centuries later, the first time ordinary English people heard the service in their own language. The experience was profoundly strange. The words were words they knew, the words of prayer and worship that marked the hours and seasons of Christian life, but now they were in English, comprehensible, present, available to anyone who could hear. Some found it moving, the word of God in the language of the people. Others found it wrong. The Latin had been part of what made the Mass sacred. The distance between human language and divine mystery, marked by a language that was not used in ordinary life. In English it sounded, to some ears, uncomfortably ordinary. In the west of England, the response was armed rebellion. The prayer book, Rebellion of 1549, brought thousands of Cornish and Devon men under arms. Their petition to the young king is one of the most vivid documents of the period. They called the new prayer book a Christmas game. They said they were simple men who understood Latin better than English in matters of worship and were being asked to receive God's word in a form that felt alien to them. They wanted the old service back. Somerset put the rebellion down with mercenary troops. German and Italian soldiers who had no feelings about English liturgical disputes and could therefore suppress them efficiently. Thousands died. The prayer book remained. Somerset himself fell the following year, outmaneuvered by his rival John Dudley, who became Duke of Northumberland and took control of the government and of Edward with a smoothness that disguised how ruthless the transition had actually been. Northumberland pushed the Reformation further still. Altars were replaced by simple wooden tables. The doctrine of transubstantiation was removed from official teaching. England was moving toward a genuinely Protestant theology, not just a Catholic church with an English head. Edward appeared to support the direction, but Edward was not well. The signs had been accumulating since 1552. A persistent cough, weight loss, fatigue beyond the ordinary tiredness of a busy young king. By the spring of 1553, it was clear to his physicians and to the men who governed in his name that the king was dying. The illness was likely tuberculosis, though the medicine of the time named it differently and understood it imperfectly. What everyone understood was the direction. It was going downward, and it was not going to turn. The question of who came next was now urgent in the worst possible way, according to Henry's will and the Act of Succession. The throne would pass after Edward to Mary, his daughter by Catherine of Aragon, and then to Elizabeth, his daughter by Anne Boleyn. Both women had been declared illegitimate at various points and then reinstated by later legislation. Mary was Northumberland's nightmare. She was Catholic. If Mary became queen, the Reformation he had advanced and the position he had built within it would be in immediate danger. So Northumberland worked on Edward in those final weeks, persuading the dying king to alter the succession. Edward was 15 years old and convinced Protestant and worried about what a Catholic queen would do to the church he believed in. He was also in the hands of a man who understood exactly how to frame an argument to a dying boy, who wanted to believe his death would not undo everything he cared about. Edward was persuaded. A document was drawn up in the king's hand, altering the succession to exclude both Mary and Elizabeth on grounds of illegitimacy, passing the crown to Lady Jane Grey, a Protestant young woman who happened to be married to Northumberland's son. The document was signed. Edward died on the 6th of July, 1553. He was 15 years old. He had been king for 6 years and never old enough to truly govern. He had been the vessel into which other men poured their ambitions and their theological convictions, used by the adults around him, and genuinely believing, to the end, that the use being made of him was in service of God. Henry VIII had gotten his son. The son could not save what his father had built. The throne of England was now in law, and in the desperate hope of John Dudley, the property of a teenage girl who did not want it. Her name was Jane. She would be queen for 9 days. The Tower of London, July 1553. Jane Grey was 16 years old when they told her she was Queen of England. And she cried. Not the careful performed weeping of a young woman trying to appear appropriately humble before accepting something she had long desired. Real crying. The kind that comes from genuine distress. From a person who has just been handed a burden they did not ask for, and can already feel the weight of it before they have had a moment to think. By the account of a witness present in the room, Jane told the people assembled before her that the crown was not her right and that it pleased her not. She said Lady Mary was the rightful heir and that she herself was unworthy of the title. She prayed aloud, asking God to give her the grace to govern with his approval and for the good of the people. Then, because she had no real choice, she accepted. Jane Grey was not a plotter. She was not ambitious. She was not Northumberland's willing instrument. She was a young woman of genuine intelligence and deep Protestant conviction who had been manoeuvred into an impossible position by the adults around her, principally her own father Henry Grey and her father-in-law John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, and who understood with a clarity that was almost certainly painful that she was being used rather than elevated. She had been married to Northumberland's son, Guildford Dudley, in May of 1553, a match arranged by her parents over her reported objections. The marriage was a transaction, the currency being Jane's Tudor blood and Protestant credentials and her proximity to the dying king. Northumberland had organized several such marriages that spring as he positioned his family for what he saw coming. When Edward died on the 6th of July and the succession document naming Jane as heir was produced, London was told it had a new queen. Jane was brought to the Tower, which was, at that point, still a royal residence rather than exclusively a prison. The crown was brought out and offered to her. She accepted it weeping. Northumberland's plan had a logic to it. Edward's succession document was legally signed and witnessed and approved by the council. The Protestant establishment, the men who had built their careers and fortunes on the Edwardian Reformation, had strong incentives to support Jane and keep Mary off the throne. Northumberland had the council, the Tower, the treasury, and the machinery of government. What he did not have was legitimacy. Mary Tudor was at Hunsdon in Hertfordshire when Edward died. She received the news and acted with a decisiveness that nobody who had observed her patient endurance of the previous 2 decades had quite prepared for. She did not hesitate. She did not negotiate. She did not wait to see how the situation developed. She rode to Norfolk, to the country where support for her was strongest, sent letters to the council, demanding they proclaim her queen, as was her right, under her father's will and the Act of Succession, and began raising an army. The response was remarkable. Men came, not in ones and twos of polite support, but in the thousands. The spontaneous gathering of a population that had been told it had a new queen, it had never heard of, and had collectively decided it did not accept the substitution. The people of Norfolk and Suffolk, conservative in their religion and loyal to the Tudor name that Mary carried, in a way Jane Grey did not, turned out for her with a speed that stunned Northumberland. The council in London watched the numbers growing and began doing what councils do when they sense they have backed the wrong side. They calculated. They reassessed. They looked at the situation with the cold eyes of men who had survived by being on the right side at the right moment, and recognized, with the particular clarity that self-interest provides, that they had made an error. Within days the council had flipped. Proclamations were issued, declaring Mary Queen. The Duke of Suffolk, Jane's own father, went to the Tower where his daughter was resident and told her she was no longer queen and should come down from the throne. Jane later wrote that she had been glad to take off the crown and had not coveted it. Northumberland was in the field with a small army when the news reached him that London had declared for Mary. His own men began to desert. He rode into Cambridge and proclaimed Mary Queen himself. Whether from calculation or despair or both, it did not help him. He was arrested within days. Jane Grey was left in the Tower. She had gone in as queen. She stayed as prisoner. Mary entered London on the 3rd of August, 1553, and the crowds that welcomed her were the largest and loudest the city had produced in decades. She rode through streets lined with people who were cheering with genuine feeling, not because they had been organized to cheer, and not because they feared the consequences of silence, but because they wanted her to be there. The legitimacy that Northumberland had tried to manufacture through legal instruments and succession documents was something Mary possessed without trying. Simply by being her father's daughter and the rightful heir in the understanding of enough English people to matter decisively, Northumberland was tried and executed in August. He converted to Catholicism before his death, a conversion so sudden and so convenient that the Protestant prisoners in the Tower, who watched it from their windows, reportedly found it difficult to take seriously. Jane Grey was tried in November and convicted of treason, a conviction that everyone involved understood to be legally accurate and politically complicated. Mary did not initially intend to execute her. Jane had not plotted against the crown. She had been a pawn in someone else's game, and the whole country knew it. Mary inclined toward mercy, toward allowing Jane to live in the Tower indefinitely. A prisoner, but a living one. Then, in February of 1554, a rebellion broke out. Sir Thomas Wyatt, the younger, led an armed group against Mary's announced intention to marry Philip of Spain. The Protestant and nationalist faction that feared Spanish influence in England took up arms. The rebellion failed, but its failure produced political pressure that mercy could not withstand. Jane's father had been involved. Jane herself. Despite having no part in the plot and no apparent knowledge of it, was now too dangerous to keep alive. The execution order was signed. Jane Grey died on Tower Green on the 12th of February, 1554. She was asked on the scaffold if she had consented to take the crown. She said she had not, but that she had done wrong in accepting it, and asked forgiveness of God and of the people. She forgave those who had brought her to this place. She said she died a true Christian woman. She was blindfolded. She felt for the block and could not find it, and called out, "What shall I do? Where is it?" Someone guided her hands to it. She laid her head down. She was 16 years old. She had been queen for 9 days. She had done nothing wrong except be born into a family that found her bloodline useful and a country that could not afford to leave her alive. The 9 days of Jane Grey are remembered as a footnote, a strange parenthetical between Edward's death and Mary's reign that lasted barely long enough to be noticed. But what those 9 days reveal is worth sitting with. Northumberland had everything except recognition. Mary had nothing except recognition. And Mary won in 9 days. The lesson was not lost on the young woman sitting in different rooms of the same tower, watching what happened to people who were used as weapons in other people's political battles. Her name was Elizabeth. She was 20 years old, and she was paying very close attention. London, August 1553. Mary Tudor rode into her capital on a warm summer day, and the city gave her something it had not given anyone in a very long time. A real welcome, the kind a crowd makes when something it believed was right has turned out to be right after all. She was 37 years old, small and slight, with the reddish hair that was the Tudor inheritance, and the set of her jaw that was entirely her own. She had spent most of her adult life being told she was nothing, that her birth was illegitimate, that her mother's marriage had never been valid, that the name she carried was a legal fiction, and the title she claimed was not hers. She had disagreed with all of that for 20 years, and now she was riding through her city, and the city was telling her she had been right. To understand Mary I, you have to start not with the queen she became, but with the child she was, before the world decided she was inconvenient. She was born in 1516, the surviving child of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, and her early years were, by the standards of Tudor royal children, genuinely happy. Her father adored her. There are accounts of him bringing her out to show to foreign visitors, holding her up and asking if she was not a treasure. She was educated with care, given languages and music, and the theological grounding appropriate to a princess who might one day need to hold her own in European courts. Her mother oversaw her education personally. Then the world changed around her. When Mary was 11, Henry began the proceedings against her mother that would eventually destroy the marriage and everything that depended on it. When she was 13, her parents were formally separated, and she was removed from her mother's household and sent to live elsewhere. A separation designed to pressure Catherine through her daughter. When she was 17, the Act of Succession declared her illegitimate. She was no longer Princess Mary. She was Lady Mary, a title that acknowledged her existence without acknowledging her rights. She was not allowed to see her mother. This is the part that does not appear in the diplomatic correspondence and the legal records, but that was real, in a way those documents are not. A girl in her teens, then her 20s, forbidden from visiting her sick and increasingly isolated mother, writing letters that were sometimes delivered and sometimes not, asking permission to go to her that was repeatedly denied. Catherine died in January of 1536, alone at Kimbolton. Mary was not there. She never saw her mother again after the separation. The grief of that, the specific grief of a person prevented from saying goodbye by the deliberate cruelty of institutional power, was something Mary carried for the rest of her life. During the years of her illegitimacy, Mary was required to serve in the household of her infant half-sister, Elizabeth, who held the title of princess that had been taken from her. She was pressured repeatedly to sign documents acknowledging that her mother's marriage had been invalid and that her own birth was illegitimate. She resisted for a long time. Eventually, under pressure that included threats to her life passed through intermediaries, she signed. She wrote afterward to her cousin, the Emperor Charles, that she had sinned against God by agreeing to what she knew was false and prayed God would forgive her. She survived. She kept her head down and her religious practice private and her opinions carefully guarded. She learned what Elizabeth would learn after her, that survival in the Tudor court required the constant management of visibility, the careful calibration of when to speak and when to be silent, and when to be present, and when to disappear. And then, at 37, she was queen. She believed, with the completeness of a person whose faith had been the one consistent thing in a world that changed around her constantly, that her duty as queen was to return England to the Catholic Church. This was not a political calculation. It was a conviction rooted in everything she was and everything her mother had been. in the faith that had sustained them both through the years, when sustaining it had required real courage. She moved carefully at first. The Protestant bishops were removed, and Catholic ones appointed. The heresy laws abolished under Edward were reinstated. The Mass returned to English churches in the Latin that the Edwardian Reformation had replaced with English prayer. The links with Rome were restored through negotiation with the papal legate Cardinal Pole, an Englishman and a distant cousin of Mary's, a gentle and learned man who had spent his life in exile on the continent and returned now to preside over what he and Mary both believed was the restoration of England to its rightful faith. Then the burnings began. The first Protestant burned under the restored heresy laws was John Rogers, in February of 1555, at Smithfield in London. A crowd watched him die. He had translated the Bible into English, and he died for his refusal to recant his Protestant beliefs with a composure that people found, depending on their sympathies, either inspiring or appalling. He was followed by others, many others. In the 3.5 years of Mary's reign, approximately 280 people were burned for heresy in England. They came from all levels of society, from bishops to weavers, from scholars to servants. Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who had written the English prayer book, was among them. He had signed a series of recantations under pressure, and Mary had accepted the recantations but ordered his execution anyway, because his crimes against the Church were considered too grave for recantation to cover. At the stake, he withdrew his recantations and held the hand that had signed them into the fire first, saying that the unworthy hand should be punished before the rest of him. John Foxer, a Protestant writer, collected and published the stories of the martyrs in a book called Acts and Monuments, known afterward as Foxe's Book of Martyrs, and which became one of the most widely read books in the English language for the next 2 centuries. It gave Mary the name that has followed her through history, Bloody Mary. The name is not entirely wrong. 280 people burned alive for their religious beliefs is not a number that can be talked away or contextualized into insignificance. Those were real people who died real deaths. But the name is not the whole picture either. Burning heretics was not a practice Mary invented. It was standard procedure across Catholic Europe, had been used in England before her reign, would be used by Elizabeth after her reign in different forms against Catholics. What made the burnings politically damaging to Mary was not their scale by European standards, but their concentration and their visibility. They happened in public, in London and in towns across England, and they produced martyrs whose stories circulated and accumulated and gradually shifted the mood of a population that had initially welcomed Mary, but was beginning to find the cost of her restoration higher than it had anticipated. The marriage made things worse. Mary wanted to marry Philip of Spain for reasons both personal and political. Personal, because she was 37 and had spent her adult life alone and wanted, with a directness, her careful public image usually concealed, a husband. Political, because Philip was the most powerful Catholic prince in Europe, and an alliance with Spain gave England a protection against French ambitions she valued. Philip arrived in July of 1554. The marriage took place at Winchester Cathedral. He was 27. She was 38. He was courteous to her in public and absent from England as often as possible in private, returning to his Spanish and European commitments with a regularity that made clear where his priorities lay. The disparity in their feelings for each other was visible enough that even people inclined to support the match found it difficult to maintain the pretense that it was what it was supposed to be. Mary had 2 episodes during the marriage that her court interpreted as pregnancies, and that produced no child. Her body responded to her intense desire to conceive without an actual pregnancy occurring. The humiliation of the second episode, in 1557, when the court and country had been told the Queen was expecting and then had to be told she was not, was a wound that had no clean resolution. The war with France that Philip drew England into produced the final blow. In January of 1558, Calais fell to French force. Calais was the last English territory on the European continent, held since the reign of Edward III, and losing it under a queen married to a Spanish king felt like a double humiliation, proof of what critics of the marriage had been saying from the beginning, that Philip's interests and England's interests were not the same. Mary is reported to have said that when she died, Calais would be found written on her heart. She died on the 17th of November, 1558. She was 42 years old. She had been queen for 5 years. She died believing she had failed. The church she had worked to restore would be dismantled again within weeks of her death. The heir who would dismantle it was Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn. And the fact that Elizabeth was the one who would benefit from Mary's death was one of the bitter symmetries that Mary had lived with for years. She asked to be buried next to her mother. The request was not granted. She was buried in Westminster Abbey, far from Catherine of Aragon's grave at Peterborough Cathedral, separated from her mother in death, as she had been separated from her in life. History gave Mary the name Bloody Mary and moved on to Elizabeth, who fit more neatly into the story of English Protestant progress. Mary was filed as the wrong turn, the reactionary episode, the cautionary tale. But here is what that filing leaves out. Mary I was the first queen regnant in English history, the first woman to rule England in her own right, rather than through a husband. She governed. She made decisions. She sat in council and argued policy with men who had spent their careers in a world where women did not do those things. She used the law and the courts and the instruments of royal power with a competence her male predecessors would have recognized as competence. She was a woman who had been told she was nothing and refused to believe it, who had held on through 20 years of humiliation and isolation and legal erasure, and come back to claim what was hers. The failure of her reign was real. The humanity of the person inside the reign deserves more than the nickname. She was Henry VIII's daughter. She had his stubbornness and his conviction and his willingness to use the full power of the crown for what she believed was right. What she did not have was his luck, or his longevity, or the world moving in her direction. She was buried on a cold December day, and the half-sister who would undo her work was already queen. Elizabeth I was 25 years old. She had been waiting her entire life for this. The Tower of London, March 1554. Elizabeth Tudor was 20 years old when she walked through Traitor's Gate. The gate opened directly onto the Thames, low and dark, cut into the base of the tower wall. It had been used for generations to bring prisoners in without the visibility of a land entrance, without the crowd that would gather and watch and remember. You came in by water, quietly, and you did not always come out. Elizabeth stepped out of the barge onto the wet stone stairs and sat down and refused to go further. She said she was no traitor and had no cause to enter that place. The lords accompanying her told her she had no choice. She sat in the rain on the cold stairs and said she preferred to sit there than enter. She was moved inside, eventually. She had no choice about that either. She spent the next 2 months in the Tower, held on suspicion of involvement in the Wyatt Rebellion, the Protestant uprising against Mary's Spanish marriage that had collapsed in February. The connection to Elizabeth was tenuous. Wyatt had written to her. Whether she had encouraged him, whether her name had been invoked without her consent by men who hoped her involvement would give their cause legitimacy, was never established to the satisfaction of anyone trying to produce a legal case against her. Mary's counsel wanted to find that case. Several advisers pushed hard for Elizabeth's execution, arguing that, as long as she lived, she would be a focus for Protestant resistance. They were not wrong about the political logic. They could not produce the evidence the law required. Elizabeth survived the Tower and was released in May of 1554, sent to Woodstock in Oxfordshire, a royal manor where she lived under house arrest and the supervision of a keeper who tried to keep a prisoner, who was also a princess, comfortable enough to prevent complaint, while restricted enough to prevent danger. She spent approximately a year at Woodstock. She read. She walked in the gardens when permitted. She waited. She had been waiting since she was 2 years old. Since the year her mother was executed, and her father declared her illegitimate, and her status in the world became something that could be changed by a royal proclamation on any given morning, she had waited through her father's remaining years, present at court, but never secure. She had waited through Edward's reign, Protestant, like Edward, more valued than under Henry, but always aware the wheel could turn. She had waited through the terrifying opening of Mary's reign. When the Catholic Restoration began, and the question of what to do with a Protestant half-sister, second in line to the throne, was debated openly in Mary's court, she had learned things while waiting. From her father she had learned that absolute conviction was dangerous. Henry VIII had been absolutely convinced throughout his reign. Convinced that his marriage to Catherine was invalid. Convinced that Anne was guilty. Convinced that More's silence was treason. The absolute conviction produced absolute action, and the absolute action produced consequences that rippled outward and destroyed people who had nothing to do with the original conviction. Power exercised with absolute certainty was power that did not check itself, and power that did not check itself eventually consumed everything around it. From Edward's reign she had learned that genuine belief, sincerely held and earnestly pursued, was not sufficient protection against the people who would use your belief to serve their own ends. Edward had believed in the Protestant Reformation with a seriousness that went beyond the political. The men around him had used that belief to advance their own positions. And the result had been not the godly commonwealth Edward prayed for, but a factional struggle that ended with her brother dead at 15 and Northumberland on the scaffold. From Mary she was still learning. Mary had been certain. She had known what England needed. Known it with the confidence of a woman whose faith had sustained her through 20 years of suffering, and who therefore could not doubt that the faith was correct. She had pursued what she was certain of with a consistency and a courage that Elizabeth recognized and respected. And the pursuing had produced 280 burnings and a lost war with France, and a country that had grieved its queen before she was dead. The lesson was not that you should not believe things. The lesson was that showing the full extent of your convictions, showing everything you intended to do to the people around you, was one of the most dangerous things a person in her position could do. It gave your enemies a target. It told them exactly what mattered to you, and therefore exactly how to threaten you. It committed you to positions that circumstances might require you to abandon, and the abandonment would look like weakness or hypocrisy, which was worse than the original vulnerability. She had learned instead to keep the inside separate from the outside, to present to the world a surface that was carefully managed, that gave away exactly as much as was useful, and no more. To be many things to many people, because being one thing completely was how you ended up in the Tower. She had also learned something specific from watching Mary fail that was more operational than any of these general principles. Mary had treated Parliament as an instrument of her will rather than as a partner in governance. Parliament had given her what she demanded, while quietly not giving her what she needed, which was genuine cooperation and the goodwill of the men who would implement her policies in their counties and parishes. The heresy laws had passed because Mary wanted them to pass, but the enforcement, the practical business of identifying Protestants and bringing them to trial and seeing the sentences carried out, depended on local magistrates and church officials who varied enormously in their enthusiasm for the work. The burnings had happened, but they had not happened everywhere, and in many places had been managed in ways that produced martyrs rather than examples. Parliament was not a rubber stamp. Elizabeth had watched Mary use it as one, and had watched the costs of that approach. She intended to do something different. When the news came that Mary was dead, in November of 1558, Elizabeth was at Hatfield House, the manor in Hertfordshire that had been her residence through the final period of her semi-captivity. She was in the garden, under an oak tree, reading. The messengers came with the ring that Mary had designated as confirmation of her death. The ring that would be brought to Elizabeth as the signal that she was now queen. She looked at the ring, and then looked up and said, in Latin, words from the Psalms, "This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes." Then she fell to her knees on the ground. Then she stood up and began to receive the men who were already gathering around her as queen. The movement from her knees to standing took perhaps 30 seconds. She was done with grief, and done with prayer, and done with remembering everything that had brought her here. There was work to do. She was 25 years old, and she had been educated by circumstances that no school could have provided and no tutor could have designed. Educated in the actual substance of what ruling England required and what it cost, and how quickly it could all be taken away. Mary had taught her the final lesson, and the most important one. Being right was not enough. You had to be right in a way that enough people were willing to follow. And you had to be willing to let them follow at their own pace rather than driving them faster than they could go. You had to know when to push and when to wait, and when to simply hold the space open and let time do the work. She walked into Hatfield House to begin the business of being queen. And the world she walked into had been shaped in every particular by what had happened in the previous 73 years. The institutions Cromwell had built, the religious settlement that was still unresolved after 3 contradictory reformations in 20 years, the treasury that Mary's war with France had depleted, the council that needed reorganization, the marriage question that was already being raised before she had been queen for 24 hours. She knew all of it. She had been watching all of it her entire life. What she was going to do about it she would work out as she went, responding to what actually happened rather than to what she had decided in advance should happen. It was the opposite of everything her father had been, and it was going to work better than anything he had managed since the first decade of his reign. Whitehall Palace, November 1558. Within hours of Elizabeth being declared queen, the marriage proposals began. The woman had been queen for less than a day. Her sister's body was not yet cold, and the men around her, the men who would serve her and advise her and spend the next 4 decades trying to manage her, were already discussing which foreign prince or English nobleman she should marry. Because in the political understanding of 1558, a queen without a husband was an incomplete political fact, a sentence without a verb. The assumption was so deep and so automatic that most of the men making it did not recognize it as an assumption. They thought they were being practical. A queen needed a husband because she needed an heir, and she needed someone to handle the military dimensions of leadership that a woman was not considered equipped for, and she needed the legitimacy that a king consort would provide in negotiations with foreign powers who did not quite know how to deal with a woman as an independent, political actor. Elizabeth knew all of this. She had thought about it more carefully than any of them had, because her survival had depended for years on thinking carefully about things other people assumed were settled. She had also thought about what a husband would actually mean in practice. A foreign prince meant marrying his foreign policy. Mary had married Philip of Spain, and England had fought Spain's war with France and lost Calais, and spent 3 years being directed by a man whose primary interests lay elsewhere. An English nobleman meant choosing among rivals. Every powerful family in England had someone to put forward, and whoever she chose would represent the elevation of that family over every other, the creation of a new centre of power within the English aristocracy that every other family would then have incentives to undermine. She would spend her reign managing the consequences of that choice rather than governing the country. Unmarried, she retained control, complete control, of a kind that no married queen could have, of a kind that no king ever had to think about, because no one would question whether a king's judgment was being directed by his wife. The cost of that control was what Parliament and her council kept telling her it was. Without an heir, without a child of her body, the Tudor dynasty ended with her. She heard this argument every year for 45 years. She never publicly admitted it was unanswerable, because admitting that would have required her to either produce an heir or confess that she had chosen not to, and either admission constrained her in ways she would not accept. She kept the question open instead. She negotiated marriage with foreign princes for decades without concluding the negotiations. She allowed the English court to believe, periodically, that she was on the verge of a decision. Then she made no decision. She used the prospect of marriage as a diplomatic instrument, dangling it before foreign powers who wanted the alliance it would represent, withdrawing it when the diplomatic moment passed. Robert Dudley was the man she kept closest. They had known each other since childhood. His father had been John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, the man who had placed Jane Grey on the throne and lost his head for it, and Robert had been in the Tower at the same time as Elizabeth during Mary's reign. Imprisoned for his father's treason, they had come out of that experience together in some way that neither of them ever fully described, and that the people around them spent decades trying to interpret. She made him Master of the Horse within days of becoming queen, a position that kept him physically close to her at public events and made his importance to her immediately visible to everyone watching. She spent time with him that was in excess of what protocol required. In September of 1560, Dudley's wife Amy Robsart was found dead at the bottom of a staircase at Cumnor Place in Oxfordshire. Her neck was broken. She had been alone in the house, having sent all the servants to a fair. The inquest returned a verdict of accidental death. Nobody who mattered entirely believed it. Elizabeth did not marry Dudley. Whatever Amy Robsart's death actually was, its political consequence was to make marrying him impossible. She would be the queen who had arranged the murder of her favourite's wife in order to marry him. That was not a story she was willing to be the subject of. She created him Earl of Leicester eventually, and kept him at the centre of her court for the rest of his life. He died in September of 1588, weeks after the defeat of the Armada, and she kept his last letter to her for the rest of her life, in a box beside her bed, with the words, his last letter, written on it in her own hand. But before Dudley, and after Dudley, and running underneath and through everything, there was William Cecil. Cecil became her principal secretary on the first day of her reign, appointed before the ink was dry, on the proclamations announcing her accession, and he served her with a consistency and a loyalty that has no real parallel in Tudor history. He was a Protestant of the pragmatic, rather than the fervent variety. A man who cared about good governance with the same seriousness that other men of his generation cared about theology, who believed the function of the state was to maintain order and protect the conditions under which ordinary people could live their lives. He disagreed with her, openly, in council, on record. He wrote her memoranda laying out reasons for positions she had not taken and asking her to reconsider positions she had. She was occasionally furious with him. She did not fire him. He was occasionally convinced that her refusal to make decisions he thought were necessary was going to result in catastrophe. The catastrophe did not arrive. The first crisis of the reign, requiring immediate decision, was religion. The church Elizabeth inherited was the Catholic Church Mary had restored. The bishops were Catholic. The Mass was in Latin. The connection to Rome was formally re-established. Changing this was not going to be simple. Not if the goal was change that lasted, rather than change that produced the violent swings back and forth that had characterized English religion since 1534. The Elizabethan settlement, worked out through Parliament in 1559, was the product of exactly the quality of mind Elizabeth had developed through 25 years of watching what absolute certainty produced. It was deliberately ambiguous in the places where ambiguity was most needed. The Act of Supremacy restored royal headship of the Church, but with a title adjusted from Supreme Head to Supreme Governor, a distinction that sounds small and was actually significant. Supreme Governor allowed interpretive space that Supreme Head did not. Enough space for people who had theological objections to a woman being described as a head of anything sacred to participate in the settlement without feeling they had betrayed their principles. The Act of Uniformity restored the Protestant prayer book, but a revised version that retained enough ceremony and enough ambiguity in its key formulations about the Eucharist to allow people with different beliefs about what exactly happened at communion to say the words without being certain. They were contradicting themselves. The settlement was not what the Protestant exiles who had spent Mary's reign in Geneva and Zurich wanted. It was not what conservative Catholics who had supported Mary's restoration wanted. It was something that most people in England could live with, which was exactly what Elizabeth intended, and it held, more or less, for the rest of her reign. There were priests who continued to say the Old Mass privately for Catholic families who would not attend the Protestant service. There were Protestants who found the settlement too ceremonial, too connected to the old forms, who wanted a more complete purification of the Church from the remnants of Rome. Both groups existed. Both groups caused problems. Elizabeth managed both with the same combination of patience and occasional severity, and she applied to every political problem she faced. She did not try to reach into people's consciences. Her government required outward conformity, attendance at the church service, acknowledgement of the royal supremacy. What people believed privately was a matter she preferred not to pursue as long as it did not translate into political action against her. This distinction between the outer and the inner, between required conformity and permitted private belief, was a genuinely new idea in English governance. It was not tolerance in the modern sense. It was management, but it produced something that functioned like tolerance in its practical effects. A country where religious difference was contained rather than violently suppressed. Mary had tried to suppress it violently. Elizabeth contained it managerially. The difference between those two approaches is part of what the word Elizabethan means when people use it to describe something that worked. The marriage question did not go away. Parliament raised it in 1560, in 1563, in 1566, with a directness that temporarily ended the parliamentary session when Elizabeth told the assembled members of both houses that she did not take well to being told what to do about her own body and her own marriage. that she understood the succession question and would address it in her own time, and that she would thank them to address the business they had been summoned to address rather than her personal life. She had said plainly that her body and her marriage were hers. Nobody had quite said that before, from where she was standing, in a way that could be made to stick. She made it stick for 45 years. What Elizabeth was building in these first years of her reign, while managing religion and the marriage question and the foreign policy challenges that arrived with the regularity of weather, was something that would only become visible in retrospect. She was building a relationship with her country that did not depend on a husband or an heir or military victory or the authority of a church. She was building it out of presence and language and image and the accumulated goodwill of a population that was beginning to believe she was, in some way that was hard to articulate but easy to feel, genuinely theirs. She was learning to be England. A great crisis was coming, in the form of a queen across the border who was also Elizabeth's cousin and also Catholic, and also the focus for every Catholic hope of undoing the Elizabethan settlement. Mary, Queen of Scots, was coming, and after her, the Armada, and after that, the world would know what Elizabeth Tudor was actually made of. London, 1563. There is a portrait of Elizabeth I, painted shortly after she became queen. It shows a young woman with pale skin and auburn hair and dark, intelligent eyes, dressed well, holding a book. The face is recognizable as a face, as the face of a specific person with specific features. You can imagine the person behind it having a bad day, being uncertain about something, being tired. Now look at a portrait painted 30 years later. The face has not aged. The skin is still white, still smooth, still, without the lines that 30 years of living put on a human face. The hair is still auburn, still perfectly arranged. The gown is heavier now, encrusted with jewels and embroidery that seem to have a weight of their own, and the figure inside it has become almost architectural, a structure as much as a person. The eyes still look out at you, but they look out from further away, from behind something that was not there in the earlier portrait, a distance that is not quite human. This is not what Elizabeth I looked like in 1590. This is what Elizabeth I decided she looked like. As early as 1563, the regime was considering formal ways to regulate the Queen's image. The problem, as her court understood it, was that too many portraits were circulating that showed Elizabeth as a woman, as a person who existed in time and would age, and could be imagined being afraid or uncertain. What the Queen needed shown was something else entirely. An authorized likeness was developed, a controlled representation of the royal face, and painters working for the crown were expected to use it as the basis for official images. The face in this representation was idealized in specific ways. The skin was made uniformly white, the color of marble or of the moon, neither of which ages. The features were regularized, given a symmetry that actual human faces do not possess, placed in the category of the eternal rather than the individual. As Elizabeth aged, the portraits did not age with her. By the final decade of her reign, the gap between the woman and the image had become extreme. Foreign visitors who had seen the portraits and then encountered Elizabeth in person recorded their surprise. A small, elderly woman with a worn face and false teeth and a wig, who nevertheless moved through her court with an authority so complete that you almost forgot to notice the discrepancy between the person and the picture. Almost, but not quite. She knew about the gap. She managed it the way she managed everything. by controlling what people were allowed to see. Foreign ambassadors were received in carefully lit rooms at carefully chosen times of day. State occasions were staged with the precision of theatrical productions. The Accession Day tilts are a good example. These were tournaments held annually on the 17th of November, the anniversary of her accession. Celebrations that had developed by the 1570s into elaborate performances in which knights appeared in allegorical costumes and performed ceremonies of devotion to the Queen before competing in the joust. Elizabeth sat in the royal box and received the homage, and the crowds who watched were participating in a ceremony that told them things about their Queen and their country in the language of spectacle and symbol that political speeches could not have conveyed. She was Gloriana, the queen of the fairy realm, in Edmund Spenser's poem. She was Estrella, the goddess of justice returned to earth. She was Cynthia, the moon goddess, eternally silver and eternally beyond reach. The poets and the painters and the makers of masks generated these identities for her, and she accepted them and used them and occasionally directed them, because each image added something to the accumulated understanding of what Elizabeth was, that no single image could communicate alone. The Virgin Queen was the most powerful of these images and the most carefully managed. She presented herself as married to England. She used this language repeatedly, in speeches to Parliament and addresses to crowds, and in the careful language of state correspondence, and she meant it as a structural description of her relationship to her country. She had declined to reduce herself to the wife of one person so that she could be the queen of all of them. The image of the Virgin Queen also carried religious weight available to Elizabeth, precisely because the Protestant Reformation had eliminated the veneration of the Virgin Mary from English religious life. The emotional space that had been occupied by the Virgin, the space for a sacred feminine presence that was powerful and pure and beyond the ordinary conditions of female existence. That space was available. Elizabeth moved into it, the language used to describe her in the iconography of her reign, the white garments, the moon imagery, the emphasis on purity and inaccessibility, drew on exactly the vocabulary that had previously described the Virgin Mary. The transfer was never made explicit. It did not need to be. The images did the work on their own. The progresses were another instrument of the same project. Every summer, for most of her reign, Elizabeth left London with her court and travelled through the English countryside, staying with the great households of the gentry and nobility, appearing in towns and villages along her route, being seen by people who would never otherwise have set eyes on the Queen of England. The progresses were expensive, far more expensive for the hosts who received her than for the crown that organised them, since the obligation to house and feed the royal court and provide entertainment of appropriate magnificence could strain a family significantly. But the political value was real. She was present. She was visible. She was the queen who came to you, rather than waiting in a palace for you to come to her. And the people who saw her, the farmers and craftsmen and tradespeople who lined the roads and gathered in market squares to catch a glimpse, took that visibility personally. They had seen their queen. She had existed before their eyes as something more than a name on a proclamation or a face on a coin. Elizabeth was also a speaker of extraordinary ability, and this was perhaps the most important element of the image she built, because it was the least manufactured and the most authentically hers. She spoke English like someone who had lived inside the language and understood what it could do, who had read everything it had produced and developed instincts about sound and rhythm and emphasis that most people spend years learning and that she appeared to possess as a natural condition. Her speeches to Parliament were performances, given by someone who understood the difference between words that informed and words that moved. The speech at Tilbury in 1588, delivered to the army, assembled to resist the Armada, is the most famous example. She rode among her soldiers on a white horse, wearing a silver breastplate over a white velvet gown, and she told them that she knew she had the body of a weak and feeble woman, but that she had the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too, and that she thought foul scorn that Parma or Spain or any prince of Europe should dare to invade the borders of her realm. The speech worked because it said something the audience already believed, in words that made the belief feel newly discovered. The soldiers already knew they were going to fight. The speech gave them a story about why. The image at Tilbury worked because Elizabeth had spent 30 years constructing the symbolic vocabulary that made it work, had spent 30 years being Gloriana and the Virgin Queen and Cynthia, the moon goddess, so that when she needed to be something more immediate and more human, a warrior queen who shared the danger of her soldiers, the accumulated symbolic weight was there to carry the moment. There is something here worth naming plainly, because it sometimes gets lost in the admiration for Elizabeth's political skill. What she was doing was work. Continuous, deliberate, exhausting work. Deciding what people should see and what they should not see. Managing the gap between the person and the image with a precision that required constant attention. She understood that in the world she inhabited, where she was depended largely on what people believed about who she was, and that belief was something that could be shaped. Every leader who has ever managed a public image, every politician who has understood that the version of themselves that exists in the public mind is distinct from the private person, every brand that has understood the difference between what it sells and what it means, is working in a tradition that Elizabeth Tudor practiced at a level of sophistication and consistency that set a standard for what was possible. She understood in 1558 what most people did not fully understand until the 20th century. That power is partly real and partly performed, that the performance is not a lie, that it is part of what power actually is. She performed for 45 years, and she never fully stopped. Not even in the private rooms of her palaces, in the final years when she was old and ill, and the performance required more from her than it once had. She performed because she understood that the moment she stopped, the moment the image showed its seams and the person behind it became fully visible, the political reality would change in ways she could not control. The image held, and because the image held, England held. London, February 1587. The execution warrant had been sitting on Elizabeth's desk for weeks. She had signed it, and then told her secretary William Davison not to use it yet, and then told him she had been thinking that perhaps Mary should be killed privately, by an assassin, so that the public weight of the execution did not fall on the English crown, and then been told by Davison that this was not something he was in a position to arrange, and then done nothing for another week. This was Elizabeth at her most maddening and her most characteristic. The decision had been made in everything except the final moment of its making. Mary, Queen of Scots, had been in English custody for 19 years. She had been the subject of plot after plot, some real and some uncovered and developed by the intelligence operation run by Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth's spy master, who had spent years demonstrating that Mary was not simply a political inconvenience, but an active participant in schemes to remove Elizabeth from the throne. The Babington plot, uncovered in 1586, was the one that ended the debate. Anthony Babington and a group of Catholic conspirators had planned to assassinate Elizabeth, free Mary, and place her on the throne with Spanish military support. Walsingham's agents had infiltrated the plot from its early stages. Mary had communicated with the conspirators through letters hidden in beer barrels delivered to her prison at Chartley, letters that were intercepted and copied by Walsingham's people before being sent on, so that the correspondence continued while the evidence accumulated. Mary wrote a letter endorsing the assassination of Elizabeth. She was tried in the autumn of 1586. The evidence against her was presented. She was convicted. The political pressure on Elizabeth to sign the execution warrant became, in the months that followed, essentially irresistible. She signed it in February of 1587 and told Davison to keep it until she gave further instructions. Davison brought it to the council. The council sealed it and dispatched it to Fotheringhay Castle in Northamptonshire without waiting for further instructions. Mary, Queen of Scots, was beheaded on the 8th of February, 1587. Elizabeth's reaction when told was fury, directed at the council that had acted without her explicit final authorization, directed particularly at Davison, who was sent to the Tower and fined ruinously, though not executed, a distinction that the men watching found somewhat confusing given the scale of Elizabeth's apparent anger. Whether the fury was real or performed is a question Elizabeth herself probably could not have answered cleanly. Real in that she genuinely disliked being maneuvered into a decision she would have preferred to delay indefinitely. Performed in that executing a queen set a precedent she found genuinely troubling, the precedent that queens could be executed, which had implications for her own position that were not comfortable to contemplate. Both things at once. As usual, Mary, Queen of Scots, had been the most dangerous person in Elizabeth's world for 19 years. And dangerous not because of her military power, which was non-existent by the time she arrived in England in 1568, but because of what she represented. She was Catholic. She had a claim to the English throne that was arguably stronger than Elizabeth's own in the eyes of those who considered Elizabeth illegitimate. She was the focus of Catholic hope in England and across Europe. For a reversal of the Protestant settlement that Elizabeth had built, she had been Queen of Scotland from 6 days old. She had been Queen of France briefly through her first marriage. She had returned to Scotland to rule a Protestant country as a Catholic queen, and had managed it with some skill until a series of events, including the murder of her second husband, Lord Darnley, in circumstances that implicated her, and her subsequent marriage to the Earl of Bothwell, who was widely believed to have arranged the murder, produced a rebellion that forced her from the Scottish throne. In 1568, she crossed the border into England and threw herself on Elizabeth's mercy as one queen to another. Elizabeth's mercy took the form of 19 years of comfortable imprisonment in a series of English houses and castles, under supervision that ranged from relatively relaxed to closely controlled, depending on how alarmed the current political situation made her captors. Mary spent those years writing letters, maintaining correspondence with Catholic powers across Europe, the thread connecting her to the network of people who believed she should be on the English throne. She was executed on a cold February morning in the great hall of Fotheringhay Castle. She wore black over a petticoat of crimson, the Catholic colour of martyrdom. She was 54 years old. By the account of witnesses, she was calm, to a degree that the people executing her found difficult to face. She said she was happy to die for her faith. She forgave her executioners. She placed her head on the block. It took the executioner 3 strokes to complete the work. When he held up her head by the hair came away in his hand. It was a wig, The head fell to the floor, and the witnesses saw that Mary, Queen of Scots, had the grey hair of an old woman, that the auburn hair of the portraits had been, in the end, a performance as deliberate as anything Elizabeth had ever done. Even in death, the gap between the person and the image. Philip II of Spain had been building the Armada since 1585. The reasons were multiple and accumulated over years. English support for the Protestant rebels in the Spanish Netherlands, who were fighting for independence from Spanish rule. The raids of English privateers on Spanish shipping and Spanish colonial possessions in the Americas. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, who had named Philip her heir. The straightforward, strategic calculation that England was a Protestant power that supported Spain's enemies and would continue doing so as long as Elizabeth lived. The fleet Philip assembled was extraordinary by any measure. 130 ships, more than 20,000 soldiers and sailors. It was called the Invincible Armada, a name that history has made ironic, but that in the spring of 1588 was not obviously wrong. Elizabeth knew it was coming. Walsingham's intelligence network had been tracking the preparations for years. The English fleet was readied under the command of Lord Howard of Effingham, with Francis Drake as his vice-admiral. The same Drake who had sailed around the world and who had raided the Spanish port of Cadiz in 1587, destroying enough Spanish supplies to delay the Armada's departure by approximately a year. The Armada sailed in May of 1588 and was met in the Channel by the English fleet in a series of engagements that ran from late July into August. The English ships were smaller and faster and more maneuverable than the great galleons of Spain. The English tactic of fighting at long range with artillery, rather than coming alongside for boarding actions that Spanish naval doctrine favoured, gave them advantages that the size of the Armada could not straightforwardly overcome. The decisive engagement came off the Flemish coast in early August. After the English sent fireships into the anchored Armada at midnight and drove the Spanish fleet into confusion and open water where the English guns could find them. The Armada was badly damaged and could not execute the plan to collect the Spanish army waiting on the Flemish coast. It turned north, intending to sail around Scotland and Ireland and back to Spain. The weather that followed was worse than the English guns. Storms on the Atlantic coast of Ireland drove more than 20 ships onto the rocks. Thousands of men drowned or were killed when they reached shore. Of the 130 ships that sailed from Spain, approximately 67 returned. Elizabeth came to Tilbury in August, before the outcome was certain, to review the army assembled to resist the expected Spanish landing. She wore the silver breastplate. She rode the white horse. She gave the speech. The speech worked, not because it was eloquent, though it was, but because she was there. She was not in a palace behind walls, being protected by the men who were risking their lives. She was among them, in the field, smaller than anyone expected, and more present than anyone had quite prepared for. And she told them she was ready to fight and die among them. England did not beat Spain because God was on its side, though England said so loudly for generations. England beat Spain because Spain's plan was complicated and English resistance was not, and because the weather on the Irish coast in the autumn of 1588 was catastrophic for ships navigating unknown coastlines in the dark. But what the victory produced in England was a story. A small Protestant island nation had stood against the greatest Catholic power in the world and won. A queen who had refused to be owned by any man or any foreign power had led her people through the greatest external threat in living memory and emerged intact. England had always been, would always be, something distinct from the continent, set apart by more than the Channel, by something in its nature that made it capable of things larger and more powerful nations could not manage. This story was not entirely true. Stories that nations tell about themselves rarely are. But it became true in the way the most important national stories become true, by being believed, by being repeated, by shaping the understanding that subsequent generations have of what they are and what they can do. The England that emerges from the Armada is recognizably the England that would eventually build an empire and write the rules of the world for 2 centuries, and produce the language in which more human beings communicate today than in any other language in history. It is also the England that would produce the people who decided England was not enough, who wanted something purer or freer or simply different, who got on ships and sailed west. The island had defined itself against the world, and some of the people on that island would carry that definition across the ocean and see what it could become, where there were no kings and no established church and no centuries of history weighing on every decision. They would find out soon enough. Whitehall Palace, 1598. William Cecil died on the 4th of August, and Elizabeth did not leave his bedside. She had visited him every day in the final weeks, sitting beside him and feeding him broth herself when he was too weak to manage it alone. The Queen of England performing the small acts of care that servants performed for ordinary people because she wanted to do it, and because there was nobody in the world she had known longer or trusted more completely. He was 77 years old. He had been in her service since the first day of her reign, 40 years earlier. And in that time he had argued with her and contradicted her and written her memoranda explaining at length why the decisions she was making were wrong, and had implemented those decisions anyway with a loyalty that never, in 40 years, gave way. He was her last connection to the beginning. Leicester had died in September of 1588, weeks after the Armada. His final letter to her was found in her bedside box when she herself died 15 years later, with the words, "his last letter," written on it in her own hand. Walsingham had died in 1590. Her spy master, the man who had built the intelligence network that caught the Babington plotters and forced the decision about Mary Queen of Scots, gone without ceremony because he had spent his personal fortune in the Crown's service and could not afford a funeral that matched his importance. Hatton had died in 1591. Knollys in 1596. The men who had built Elizabethan England were gone, one after another, and the men who replaced them were younger and did not know her the way the old ones had, did not carry the shared history that made certain conversations unnecessary because both people already understood the context. She was 65 years old, and she had outlived the world she had made. The final decade of her reign is the part that the mythology of Elizabeth tends to move through quickly. A brief dimming before the eternal light of Gloriana, a period to be acknowledged and left behind on the way to the dignified end that the story requires. The reality was harder than that and more interesting. The economy was under strain. Years of war with Spain had drained the treasury that Cecil had managed so carefully, and the taxation required to fund the continuing conflict had produced a level of parliamentary resistance that was new in Elizabeth's experience. Parliament was willing to grant money, but it was increasingly willing to attach conditions to the granting, to use the Crown's need as leverage for extracting concessions on policy questions it would not previously have raised so directly. The monopolies question came to a head in 1599 and again in 1601, when parliamentary anger at the system of royal monopolies, the grants that gave individuals exclusive rights to trade in particular commodities and that had become a significant source of corruption and consumer hardship, produced confrontations in the House of Commons that went further than anything Elizabeth had faced from Parliament in the previous 4 decades. Her response to the 1601 confrontation was one of the most remarkable performances of her reign. She was 68 years old and had learned everything there was to learn about the relationship between a monarch and a parliament over 40 years of watching and negotiating and occasionally confronting. She agreed to reform the monopolies. But she did it in a way that framed the concession as a gift from her grace rather than a surrender to parliamentary pressure, that thanked her members for bringing the abuses to her attention and implied she had been as troubled by them as they were. Then she gave what became known as her Golden Speech, received by a parliamentary delegation at Whitehall. She told them she had never been greedy or scraping, that among the great princes of her time, she had reigned with their loves, that though God had raised her high, she counted the glory of her crown in that she had reigned with their loves. And then she said something that stopped the room. She said, "Though you have had and may have many mightier and wiser princes sitting in this seat, yet you never had, nor shall have, any that will love you better." The members of Parliament who heard it wept. Men who had been in contention with her over monopolies minutes earlier wept, because she had said something that was true, that they recognized as true, that went underneath the political argument to the human fact beneath it. She had loved them, whatever the policy disagreements, and the strategic calculations, and the image management, and the deliberate ambiguities. She had loved the country she governed in a way that was real, that showed up in the decisions she made when love and calculation pointed the same direction, and in the decisions she made when they did not. In 45 years of unbroken attention to the question of what England needed and how to provide it, she was performing as she always performed. And she was also not performing in the sense that the best performances are not performances at all, but the most precise expression of something genuine. Then there was Essex. Robert de Veru, the second Earl of Essex, was the last person Elizabeth Tudor allowed herself to love in a way that made her vulnerable, and he was the worst possible choice for it. He was 21 when he came to court in 1586, the stepson of Robert Dudley, and in some ways Dudley's conscious replacement after Dudley's death. Young and physically striking and reckless, in a way that was exciting until it became dangerous. He had the confidence of a man who had never seriously failed at anything, and the judgment of a man who had never fully thought about the difference between what he wanted and what he could actually achieve. Elizabeth was 33 years older than him. She gave him access and favor and military commands that his record did not justify, and he took everything she gave him and wanted more. In the way that people who are given everything by someone who loves them sometimes mistake the love for confirmation that they deserve everything. He was sent to Ireland in 1599 to put down the rebellion led by Hugh O'Neill, the Earl of Tyrone, and he took the largest army England had sent to Ireland in living memory and achieved almost nothing with it. He negotiated a truce with O'Neill that Elizabeth had explicitly told him not to negotiate, then abandoned his command entirely and rode back to England without permission to throw himself on Elizabeth's mercy in person. He arrived at her chambers at Nonsuch Palace early on a September morning, before she had dressed or done her hair or prepared herself for anyone to see her. He burst in and found her as she was, the old woman rather than the image, and knelt and spoke to her, and she received him more warmly than the situation warranted, because she was not prepared for the encounter, and her feelings overrode her judgment. By the afternoon, when she had had time to think, the warmth was gone. He had deserted his command. He had negotiated a truce she had forbidden. He had returned without permission. He had entered her private chambers unannounced and seen her in a condition she permitted no one to see her in. She placed him under house arrest. She stripped him of his offices. She forbade him the court. He had made his final mistake in the private chamber at Nonsuch. But the consequences were still accumulating. In February of 1601, Essex led an armed group of followers into London, intending by his later account to reach the Queen and free her from the evil counsellors who had turned her against him. It was a plan so confused in its object and so thin in its support that it fell apart within hours. London declined to rise in Essex's support in the way he had apparently expected it would. He was arrested, tried, and executed on the 25th of February, 1601, on Tower Green, where Anne Boleyn had died 65 years before. Elizabeth signed the execution order. She did not dissolve. She did not perform grief in public. She did what she had always done, which was to keep the inside separate from the outside and continue governing, but she was changed by it. The people closest to her noticed. The sadness she carried after Essex was different from the sadness she had carried after Leicester and Cecil. Different in quality, more like a failure than a loss. The particular heaviness of a person who knows they allowed something to happen that their better judgment should have prevented and cannot entirely excuse themselves for it. In the autumn of 1602, she became ill, not dramatically, but persistently, in the way of a body that has used up most of its reserves and is no longer recovering from the ordinary assaults of winter. She refused to discuss it. She refused to allow her physicians to examine her properly. She sat in her chair for hours at a time, in silence, with her finger in her mouth, staring at something nobody else could see. She would not name her successor. People had been asking for years, and she had deflected the question with the skill. She deflected everything she did not want to engage with. But now the deflection was running out of time. She knew who it would be. James VI of Scotland, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, a Protestant king. The Tudor line extended through the marriage of Henry VIII's sister Margaret to the Scottish crown 2 generations earlier. She knew. She had communicated with him in the careful, coded way the situation required. She simply would not say it out loud. Saying it out loud meant acknowledging what saying it meant, that she was ending, that the dynasty she embodied was ending, that the woman who had stood at Tilbury in silver armour and told her soldiers she had the heart of a king was going to die in a chair. In silence. Having outlived everyone who had known her when she believed in her own indestructibility, she told her council, toward the end, when they asked about the succession and would not be put off any longer, that she would have no rascal succeed her, and that who should succeed her but a king? She may have touched her finger to her head when she said king. Nobody pressed her further. She died in the early hours of the 24th of March, 1603, at Richmond Palace, and the death came the way she had said it would come, lying down, in the dark. At the end, she had been queen for 45 years. She had never married. She had never named her successor until she could not avoid it any longer. She had kept England out of wars it could not afford, and fought the ones it could not avoid. She had managed religion with a steadiness that neither fully satisfied anyone nor fully excluded anyone, which was perhaps the most functional definition of successful religious settlement available. She had loved her country with a consistency that outlasted every other feeling she had. That remained when the people she had loved personally were gone, and the body that had carried her through it all was worn down to its last reserves. She was buried in Westminster Abbey. James VI of Scotland came south and became James I of England, the first Stuart king. The Tudor dynasty complete. 118 years. 5 monarchs. A dynasty that had started terrified of its own illegitimacy and ended with a woman who had made the crown so completely her own that the crown itself was less the symbol of the dynasty than the symbol of the person. The dynasty was over. What came after it was not. Richmond Palace, March 1603. Early morning. Go back to the room where we started. The candles are burning low, the ones that have been burning for 3 days, and the room has the exhausted quality of a space where people have been keeping watch too long. The ladies are still there, sitting in the corners and along the walls, not sleeping, not quite awake, in the suspended state of people waiting for something they cannot hurry. Elizabeth Tudor is on the floor. She has finally gone down. Not to the bed, she refused for so long, but to the cushions her attendants placed on the floor when it became clear the bed was not going to be accepted. She is lying on her side. Her eyes are open. The ring of Scotland. The ring confirming her choice of James as her successor is already gone from her finger, sent north by her council without her authorization, the way the execution warrant for Mary had been sent without her final explicit instruction. The people around her, making the decision she would not make herself. It is quiet. Outside. The Thames is running in the dark, carrying the same water past the same city that has watched 5 Tudor monarchs come and go in the space of a century, and is now waiting for whatever comes next. She dies in the early hours. And the question her dying asks, the question this entire story has been building toward, is not what the Tudors did to England. The question is what England did with what they left. Henry VII left a solvent treasury and a stabilized throne, and a dynasty that almost nobody had believed was possible. He left a governmental apparatus that ran on law and paper rather than on the personality of its lord. A kingdom that had been pulled out of medieval disorder towards something that could survive the transition from one reign to the next without collapsing. Henry VIII left the Church of England, which is still there, still functioning, still the established church of a country that has changed in almost every other way imaginable. He left a parliament that had been used as an instrument of royal will, and, in being so used, had learned something about its own power that it would not forget. He left Cromwell's administrative system, built to serve the king and destined to outlive the king and become the permanent architecture of the state. He left, without intending to, a religious landscape in motion, a country asking questions about faith and authority and conscience that would not stop being asked for centuries. Edward VI left the Book of Common Prayer, Cranmer's prose, language so deep in the grain of English that it shaped the way English speakers heard beauty for 4 centuries and still shapes it now. He left a reformation pushed further than his father had pushed it. The direction established, even if the destination was still in argument. Mary I left something nobody talks about much. She left the precedent of a woman ruling England in her own right. She had been the first. The machinery of government had not collapsed. The country had not become ungovernable. A woman had sat on the throne and made decisions and conducted wars and managed parliament and signed execution warrants. And England had continued. That fact mattered for what came next. Even though what came next tried to present itself as unprecedented, Elizabeth I left the most. A professional navy that would become the foundation of a maritime empire. A state that had learned to function as a state, with institutions and processes and precedents that continued regardless of who wore the crown. The Elizabethan settlement. An established church, ambiguous enough to contain most of the population, and functional enough to endure in modified forms to the present day. A cultural moment of extraordinary richness. Shakespeare writing his plays. Marlowe and Spencer and Sidney and Johnson, and the whole flowering of a literature still being read and performed 5 centuries later. She also left, without knowing it and without using the words. The conditions for something that did not yet have a name. Follow the thread. The Church of England that Henry created produced people who believed the Reformation had not gone far enough, who wanted a church purified more completely of the remnants of Rome, who found the Elizabethan settlement too comfortable and too compromising. Some of them left England during the reign of James I, who proved less tolerant of religious dissent than Elizabeth had been. They went to the Netherlands first, to the Protestant cities of Leiden and Amsterdam, and found they could worship freely there, but that their children were becoming Dutch, and something in their English identity was dissolving. In 1620, a group of them organized a crossing. They chartered a ship called the Mayflower, and they sailed with 102 passengers, separatists and others with different reasons for making the journey, toward a coastline they called the New World. They arrived at Cape Cod in November of 1620. Before they disembarked, they drew up a compact, an agreement about how they would govern themselves in the absence of any established authority. It said in plain English that the undersigned combined themselves together into a civil body politic for the better ordering and preservation of themselves. A civil body politic, self-governing, not waiting for a king to tell them how, organizing themselves according to principles they had derived from their own understanding of what governing was for and what it should do. Those principles did not come from nowhere. They came from England. They came from a century of arguments about sovereignty and authority, and the relationship between rulers and the ruled that the Tudor dynasty had forced into the open by its own needs and its own conflicts. They came from a parliament that had learned in the Tudor years what it was capable of. They came from a Reformation that had insisted, in its various forms, that the individual conscience had standing before God that no institution could simply override. The Tudors had not set out to produce those principles. They had set out to secure a throne and produce an heir and maintain the power of a dynasty. What they produced instead, in the friction and the conflict and the breaking and the rebuilding of 118 years, was a country that contained those principles in its legal and political and religious architecture, that had argued about them long enough that they were part of how the country thought about itself, and the people who carried those principles across the Atlantic, who applied them to a new place with no kings and no established church and no centuries of obligation weighing on every decision, built something from them that their English ancestors had not built at home. They built it with contradictions written into it from the beginning that would take generations and a civil war and arguments that have not finished to work through. They built it with the inheritance of a century of Tudor conflict about who gets to say what God wants, who gets to control what a conscience decides, who gets to rule, and what the ruling is for, and what the people being ruled are owed in return. The Tudors did not create America, but they helped create the English world that made America possible, and the distance between those two things is smaller than it might appear. Stand in Westminster Abbey and look at the tomb of Elizabeth I, the marble effigy lying on stone with the carved features and the crown and the scepter and the orb. The image maintained in permanence the way she maintained it in life, untouched by time, every detail controlled. Then walk a few steps to the tomb of Mary I, buried in the same monument, the two sisters finally sharing a space they spent their lives competing for. Then think about the Parliament building 2 minutes away, the direct institutional descendant of the Parliament the Tudors used as a weapon, and that learned from being used what it was capable of. The Church of England, whose spires are visible from the Abbey steps. The common law courts, whose procedures descend in unbroken line from the legal reforms of the Tudor century. The English language itself, shaped in these years by the Bible that Tyndale translated, and Cranmer's prayer book, and the plays of Shakespeare, the language in which more human beings communicate today than in any other language in the history of the world. They wanted a bloodline. They got a world, and that world, imperfect and unfinished, and still arguing about the questions they first forced into the open, is what you live in now. The Tudor dynasty ended on a March morning in 1603, in a room full of dying candles and watchful women, and one old queen who had finally, at the very end, agreed to lie down. The argument they started is still going.